now means that the whole issue of stonewalling has become farcical, particularly when we take into account that a lot of the other outstanding questions are highly relevant for the debate we are going to be starting this afternoon.
Yeah.
What I would say is I have a lot of sympathy to members. All members are answerable to the constituents, and if you cannot get the answers, your constituents are not getting the service that should be provided. I don't think it's a satisfactory answer. I don't think it's good. I'm sure, no doubt, that you may wish to put another UQE if that's the situation, if it doesn't improve later today. Right. Further point of order, Alison.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This one relates to the answer given by the Financial Secretary to the Treasury around the accuracy of his answers. Mr Speaker, is it in order for ministers not to be clear on who they are meeting with? Because Excluded UK claim that they have had no such contact, as was inferred by the Financial Secretary to the Treasury.
Can I say, unfortunately, it's not a point of order for me, it's a continuation of the debate. And I'm sure through your good offices you'll find other ways in which to ensure that your views will be expressed, which there will be on the order paper. Right, in order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, suspend the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. We come to the 10-minute rule motion. Apologies, John Howell. Not apologising for him, though.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision for the effect of an apology in certain legal proceedings and for connected purposes. Let me start by making a declaration that I am an associate of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, since the heart of this bill lies within the dispute resolution and dispute prevention system. Let me also start out by saying what this bill does not do. It does not take away any rights that we may have to go to court on any issue. But what it does do is to introduce an element of civility and common sense back into society, in that it allows an apology to be given that is genuinely and sincerely meant without creating a legal liability that could run into millions of pounds. Simply put, an apology which does not create a legal liability will often settle a dispute rather than being seen to take the accused for every penny that they have. It should be the mark of both a mature democratic society and of its dispute resolution system that an apology, whether made publicly or privately, can and should be allowed to be meaningful and helpful rather than simply a necessary yet tokenistic gesture. An apology can truly change atmospheres and the nature of conversations and outcomes. Used appropriately, it can also help avoid a dispute going to court. Equally, it can assist the resolution of a case by changing the approach being taken. The policy driver, therefore, behind this initiative is that apologies can often unlock disputes and lead to settlement without recourse to formal legal action. Since parties may be reluctant to do anything that may be construed as an admission of liability, apologies have to date seemingly been sparse, save in cases of NHS clinical negligence. However, a culture has emerged of people and organisations not wanting to offer an apology in case it is detrimental to their legal position or deemed to be a weakness. With tragic incidents like that of Grenfell Tower and the need to improve multicultural community cohesion, the time has come to extend the current limited legislative provisions. A fresh Apologies Act would be a clear Westminster statement, as well as a simple legal mechanism to help improve our country's conversations, for it could incentivise disputing parties to make apologies, whether in the direct aftermath of an accident, mistake or other dispute, or further down the line, should the dispute escalate with a view to achieving a more amicable resolution. An NHS publication saying sorry, published in June 2017, reminds of a little-known provision in the Compensation Act, which provides an apology, offer of treatment or other redress shall not of itself amount to an admission of negligence or breach of statutory duty. More significantly, in the same medical context, there is the duty of candour under the Health and Social Act 2008, and more fully described in a leaflet published by Action Against Medical Accidents, endorsed by the Care Quality Commission. Both the Medical General Council and the Nursing and Midwifery Council advise that this means that healthcare professionals must tell the patient when something has gone wrong, apologise to the patient, offer an appropriate remedy or support to put matters right if that is possible, and explain fully to the patient the short and long-term effects of what has happened. So how has such common sense advice worked in practice? A search during the preparation of this speech found that there was limited empirical research through acknowledgements of the benefits and anecdotal examples of its successes. In fact, the most helpful insight into the successful outcomes of medical apologies comes from an article in the National Law Review, a US professional publication dated the 6th of November 2018. Bearing in mind that the majority of US states have on the one hand apology legislation, but on the other a highly litigious approach to life's adversities from the current president downwards, nonetheless, I quote as follows: "Physicians typically recall with stunning clarity the moment a patient's treatment went wrong. Following an adverse event, physicians often are tormented by competing desires to apologise and instincts to forge ahead without acknowledgement. A patient's decision to file a malpractice action may be triggered by the physician's response to a problem or lack thereof. Apologies may decrease feelings of frustration and anger that drive some plaintiffs to file lawsuits, and a study published in the Journal of Patient Safety and Risk Management found that those engaging in a collaborative communication resolution program experienced a significant decrease in the filing of legal claims, in defence costs, in liability costs, and time required to close cases. Events with medical errors were resolved by apology alone in 43% of the cases involved. Similar programs have cut the number of malpractice lawsuits and yielded dramatic litigation cost savings. Not only do the majority of US states have apology statutes, so do Australia and Canada. Even Hong Kong, whose legislature was the first jurisdiction in Asia to enact apology legislation by the 2017 ordinance, though unable to put its best intentions into effect due to the growing restrictions from mainland China on its governance and judicial systems. Turning closer to home, there is the approach taken by Holyrood with a short yet powerful statement, the Apologies Scotland Act 2016. It contains only 6 clauses, including its commencement and short title. The 2016 Act defines an apology as any statement by or on behalf of a person which indicates that the person is sorry about or regrets an act, omission or outcome, and includes any part of the statement which contains an undertaking to look at the circumstances giving rise to the act, omission or outcome with a view to preventing a recurrence. To constitute an apology within the terms of the Scottish Act, it must include an acknowledgement there has been a bad outcome, an expression of regret, sorrow or sympathy, and a recognition of direct or indirect responsibility. In addition, there may also be an undertaking to review the circumstances of the incident with a view to making improvements or learning lessons. The Act applies to all civil, not criminal, legal proceedings, with some exceptions. And the following considerations are worth noting. Qualifying apologies may be oral or in writing. The core element of an apology as defined in the Act is an indication that the person is sorry about or regrets an act, omission or outcome. Where the statement includes an undertaking to look at the circumstances with a view to preventing a recurrence, that qualifies as part of an apology. An apology does not include statements of fact or admissions of fault, so in any statement that includes both an apology and a statement of fact and or admission of fault, only the apology is inadmissible as evidence of liability. It makes it possible to apologise without fear of prejudicing the person making the apology, or the apology being used to attribute blame in litigation. It applies to all civil proceedings except 4 types of specific actions. It does not apply, as I've said, to criminal proceedings. In a subsequent article written by Scotland's most high-profile mediator, John Sturrock QC explains how this piece of legislation achieved the rare distinction of achieving enthusiastic cross-party support. I quote, "Over 4 years, Margaret Mitchell, a Conservative MSP, has piloted this legislation through the Scottish Parliament with skill and tact. As one member noted, both sides have been pretty consensual in trying to ensure that we end up with something that the Parliament can be genuinely proud of. The essence is that apologies have the great value of acknowledging that something has gone wrong and demonstrating that lessons have been learned. We all know that mistakes happen. This is a sad fact of life, and that they can often have tragic and long-lasting consequences. However, it is how we deal with those mistakes that makes the difference." John Sturrock continues, "It is clear that legislation alone cannot remove social barriers to apologising, but the bill is an important step in changing attitudes to apologies. As my fellow APBG officer, the member for Worley and I learned and have written about in our recent APBG report, the UK and Singapore as global dispute hubs, best practice lessons, policymakers and institutions in both the UK and Singapore should foster a paradigm shift where disputes are not viewed solely through a legalistic lens, but the pursuit of the ever wider and ever deeper range of dispute resolution options. It also requires thinking about disputes in a way that goes beyond the legal conceptual framework and encompasses in all aspects of commercial relationships. In conclusion, may I commend the Scottish approach to this House, a short, focused, yet of profound effect, much like the speech I've just given.
No apologies then. That the honourable member have to leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill, or as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
John Speller, Greg Clark, Chris Grayling, Chris Bryant, Kenny McCaskill, Sir Paul Beresford, Sir Roger Gale, Sir Bob Neal, Heather Wheeler, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, Rob Butler and myself, sir.
John Howell.
Apologies, Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, the 5th of March, 2021.
Friday, the 5th of March, 2021. Right. We now come to motion... Did somebody say something? No. We now come to motion number 2 relating to the business of the House. Minister to move.
Beg to move formally.
Question is on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We're now going to suspend, in order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, and suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. The Business House motion just agreed to by the House provides for motions number 3 and number 4 on today's order paper to be debated together, but the question will be put separately on each motion as the end of the debate. I now call the Prime Minister to move motion number 3, with which the House will debate number 4. Prime Minister!
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that these regulations now be approved, and I want to begin by telling the House I was hugely encouraged by a visit I paid only yesterday to a vaccine plant in North Wales, where I saw for myself the vials of one of 7 vaccines backed by the UK government that could turn the tide of our struggle against COVID, not just in this country, but around the world. It is the protection of those vaccines that could get our economies moving again and allow us to reclaim our lives. And that one plant in Wrexham could produce 300 million doses a year. And yesterday was the momentous day when it began to manufacture the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And it was a very moving moment, Mr. Speaker, because I talked to one of the brilliant young scientists there, and she described the most extraordinary moment for her in her life to be part of an enterprise that was, she thought, truly going to offer humanity a route out of this suffering. But, Mr. Speaker, we have to be realistic, and we have to accept that this vaccine is not here yet. No vaccine is here yet. And while all the signs are promising, and almost every scientist I've talked to agrees that the breakthrough will surely come, we do not yet have one that has gained regulatory approval. And we can't be completely sure when the moment will arrive. And until then, we cannot afford to relax, especially during the cold months of winter. The national measures, which are now shortly ending in England, have eased the burden on the NHS and begun to reverse the advance of the virus. Today the R is back below 1, and the ONS survey is showing that signs of the infection rate are levelling off. Imperial College London has found that the number of people with COVID has fallen by 1/3 in England since the 2nd of November. But while the virus has been contained, it has not been eradicated. The latest ONS figures suggest that out of every 85 people in England, 1 has coronavirus, far more than in the summer. Between 24th November and yesterday, 3,222 people across the UK lost their lives. And despite the immense progress of the last 4 weeks, our NHS remains under pressure, with hospitals in 3 regions, the South West, the North East and Yorkshire, all treating more COVID patients now than at the peak of the first wave. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for giving way? He did talk about the virus being eradicated. Only one virus in history has been eradicated. Containment may well be the only option open to us.
The honourable gentleman is, of course, completely right, and it is containment that is the objective of the tiering scheme that the government is announcing, which I hope that the benches opposite will support tonight, in spite of what I gather is their decision to abstain, which seems extraordinary to me. So we can't simply allow the current restrictions to expire for the reason he gives, with no replacement whatever. With the spread of the epidemic varying across the country, there remains a compelling case. For regional tiers in England, and indeed, Mr. Speaker, a compelling necessity for regional tiers. And I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank him very much. Our latest rate is 79 per 100,000. A week ago it was 178. We went in Tier 1, we've come out in Tier 2. My pubs and restaurants are in the worst of all worlds. I wonder, in asking me to support these regulations tonight, what hope the Prime Minister can give to them.
Prime Minister. Well, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I will be coming in just a moment to what we're going to be doing, what more we hope to be doing for pubs and restaurants and everybody in the hospitality sector, whose anguish and whose difficulties I think everybody in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, understands and appreciates. But I hope the House is clear what I'm not asking for today. This is not another lockdown, nor is this the renewal of existing measures in England. The tiers that I am proposing would mean that from tomorrow, everyone in England, including those in Tier 3, will be free to leave their homes for any reason, and when they do, they'll find the shops open for Christmas, the hairdressers open, the nail bars open, gyms, leisure centres, swimming pools open, and I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank the Prime Minister for giving way. My constituency of Workington sits entirely within the borough of Allerdale, where our rates have declined to a point just over 70, currently in Tier 2 restrictions. Will he commit to a more local tiering system so that the hard work of my constituents is rewarded?
Well, yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I know that this is a point that many of my honourable and right honourable friends have made to me and to the government with great force and eloquence over the last few days. We do want to be as granular as possible as we go forward to reflect the reality of the epidemic and the human geography of the epidemic, and we shall. But what I can say from tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, is that across the country, across the whole country, as I say, not just gyms and leisure centres and swimming pools, but churches, synagogues, mosques and temples will be open for communal worship. Organised outdoor sport will resume. And in every tier, you will be able to meet others in parks and in public gardens, subject to the rule of 6. And every one of those things has been, by necessity, restricted until today. Every one of them to be allowed again tomorrow. And of course, I accept that this is not a return to normality. I wish it was so. But it is a bit closer to normality than the present restrictions. And what we can't do is to lift all the restrictions at once or move too quickly in such a way that the virus would begin to spread rapidly again. And that would be the surest way of endangering our NHS and forcing us into a New Year lockdown with all the costs that would impose. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Prime Minister, and after the inconsistencies and controversies of the previous tiering system, what was required this time round was more fairness, clarity and transparency, and we were promised a regional approach. However, what the powers of be have done is that they have placed little old Slough in Tier 3, despite the fact that we have been segregated from the wider region, and there are areas in neighbouring London and Essex with higher COVID transmission rates. So why does the Prime Minister hate Slough? What have we done that has annoyed him so much?
Well, I mean, I love Slough, and I take that. But I understand what he's saying, and I appreciate people's feelings of injustice, and people do feel it. There's no question. People feel that they've been unfairly attracted by proximity into a higher tier than they deserve, and people also feel that the tiering is not working for them. What I just want to repeat the answer I gave to my honourable friend from Workington, which is that as we go forward, and I mean this very sincerely, the government will look at how we can reflect as closely as possible the reality of what is happening on the ground for local people, looking at the incidence of the disease, looking at the human geography and spread of the pandemic, and indeed the progress that areas are making in getting the virus down. And we will try to be as sensitive as possible to local effort and to local achievement in bringing that pandemic under control. And if I'll just make a little bit of progress, Mr. Speaker, because I want to say something now about our hospitality sector, which I know the House will want to hear. Because we all accept that the burden on the hospitality sector has been very great. And we feel this deeply because our pubs, our hotels, restaurants, they're in many ways the heart of our communities and part of the fabric of our identity as a country. And everybody can see that the hospitality industry has borne a disproportionate share of the burden in this crisis. There's no question about it. And that is obviously because we want to keep schools open, Mr. Speaker, and we have to take such measures as we can. I would just remind the House, however, that we're not alone in this. In France, bars, restaurants and gyms will not reopen until January the 20th, the earliest. In Germany, the hospitality sector will remain closed in its entirety over Christmas. But we will do everything in our power to support our hospitality sector throughout this crisis. We've already extended the furlough scheme for all businesses until the end of March. We've provided monthly grants of up to £3,000 for premises forced to close and £2,100 for those that remain open but have suffered because of reduced demand. We've allocated £1.1 billion for local authorities to support businesses at particular risk. And today, Mr. Speaker, we're going further with a one-off payment of £1,000 in December to wet pubs. That's pubs, Mr. Speaker, that do not serve food, as the House knows, recognising how hard they've been hit by this virus in what is typically their busiest month. We will also work with the hospitality sector in supporting their bounce back next year. Mr. Speaker, I want to stress that the situation is profoundly different now because there is an end in sight. And I'm not this afternoon seeking open-ended measures. On the contrary, these regulations come with a sunset clause at the end of February, and at that point, at the end of the 2nd of February, I should say, Mr. Speaker. And at that point, we will have sufficient, at the end of the 2nd of February, we will have sufficient data to assess our position after Christmas. And though I believe these types of restrictions will be needed until the spring, they can only be extended beyond the 2nd of February if this House votes for them, Mr. Speaker, and I give way with pleasure to my
Market Raisin Ward in the week up to 25th of November, 6 cases to go to Tier 3. East Ham Ward in London, 40 cases in that week to go into Tier 2. So what I want from my right honourable friend is an absolute personal commitment that he and his honourable friend, the Secretary of State, will look at this personally in the case of Lincolnshire, and they will do their level best to get us out of Tier 3 by Christmas.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker, I can certainly give my right honourable friend that assurance that we will look in as much granular detail as we can at the incidents throughout the country. But these are points that have been made with great power, as I say, by honourable members on all sides of the House. We'll review the allocation of tiers every 14 days, starting on the 16th of December. And I just want to make an important point to my right honourable friend and to all members who are rightly concerned about the position of their constituencies, our constituencies, in these tiers. Honourable members have it in their powers, in our power, to help move our areas down the tiers by throwing their full weight, Mr. Speaker, throwing our full weight as leaders in our communities behind community testing and seizing the opportunity to encourage as many people as possible to take part. And I give way with pleasure to my right honourable.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. Kent is the biggest county by population in Britain, and there are vast differences in the rate of COVID within it. In Tunbridge Wells, we have one of the lowest incidences in the country. So will the Prime Minister commit that at the first possible review on the 16th of December, if a particular borough meets the 5 criteria that he's set, he will move it down to a lower tier for that particular borough?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and he's quite right to raise the position of Tunbridge Wells, and the feelings of the people of Tunbridge Wells, I know, are shared by many people across the country who feel this sense of, as I say, being unjustly attracted into the wrong level of tiering. And I repeat the assurance I've given to my honourable friend from Workington and Gainsborough Hospital. We will look in granular detail, Mr. Speaker, at local incidents, look at the human geography of the pandemic, and take account of exactly what is happening every 2 weeks, as I say. And it is in the power of honourable members, to repeat my point, to help their local area move down the tiers. I'm going to give way, I think, for one last time, Mr. Speaker, to the right honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful for the Prime Minister giving way. Will you ensure that anyone who wants to take a test to confirm that they don't have the virus before they visit family members over Christmas can have a test on the NHS?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're rolling out lateral flow testing across the country, and it is open to people to get a lateral flow testing. But in general, the testing system is available at the moment for people who have symptoms. But I would urge people who are worried that they may need to be in company of those who are elderly or vulnerable to seek to get a rapid turnaround test. And may I suggest to him that one thing he could do for his constituents, if he wants to help them move out of the tier that they are in, is to encourage them all to take part in mass community testing, of a kind that the government is rolling out, and it depends very much on the cooperation of local leaders and local authorities of the kind that we've seen in Liverpool, Mr. Speaker, where since the 6th of November, over 284,000 tests have been conducted, and together with the effect of national restrictions, the number of cases fell by more than 2/3. And this is the model that I would recommend. We're now proposing that from tomorrow, Liverpool City, Region and Warrington should be in Tier 2, whereas previously, obviously, they were in Tier 3. And we want other regions and other towns, cities, communities to follow this path. And that's why, with the help of our fantastic armed forces, we'll be offering community testing to Tier 3 areas as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, let me just say, I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. What assessment has he done of compliance with previous lockdowns? And does he share my concern that people have just had enough and that the risk of non-compliance is very great, and that those who are compliant will then have the added frustration of watching those who won't comply doing whatever they want whilst they have to sit at home?
Well, Mr. Speaker, normally I find myself in agreement with my right honourable friend, but I must say I don't think that she's right in this instance, because if you look at what the British people have achieved in the last few weeks by following the guidance, by deciding to work together to get the R down, they have done just that, Mr. Speaker. Collectively, the people of this country have got the R back down below 1. That wasn't by non-compliance, Mr. Speaker. That was by the people of this country deciding to follow the rules, do it together, and get the virus down. And I would just say, Mr. Speaker, that I find it extraordinary that the official opposition, represented by the gentleman opposite, currently have no view on the way ahead and are not proposing to vote tonight. Perhaps he'd like to tell us.
Well, I'm very pleased to hear it. Many of us on this side believe that there should be restrictions, but believe that the Prime Minister's tiers are wrong. He's explaining very well there why he's going to come back on the 16th of December and come up with a system that we might be able to vote for. But the system he's coming up with today is totally inadequate. How is it possible that in Chesterfield, with 118 per 100,000, we're in Tier 3, but in London constituencies that he represents, a much higher level are in Tier 2? It's because our pub owners and our restaurateurs aren't worth it to him.
Mr. Speaker, I hope that the honourable gentleman will really think carefully about what he's just said. We're trying to look after pubs, restaurants, businesses across this entire country. And no one feels the anguish of those businesses more than this government. And I do think, however, it is extraordinary that in spite of the barrage of criticism that we have no credible plan from the party opposite. Indeed, we have no view. We have no view on the way ahead. It's a quite extraordinary thing, Mr. Speaker, that tonight, to the best of my knowledge, the right honourable gentleman opposite, who said he's always going to act in the national interest, has told his party to sit on its hands and to abstain in the vote tonight, Mr. Speaker. And I think the government has made its decision. We've taken some tough decisions, Mr. Speaker, and the Labour opposition has decided tonight heroically to abstain, Mr. Speaker. And I think when the history of this pandemic comes to be written, I think the people of this country will observe that instead of having politicians of all parties coming together in the national interest, they had one party taking the decisions and another party heroically deciding to abstain, Mr. Speaker. In the story of 2020, I think there are two great feats in which we can take a great deal of comfort. First, our country has come together in an extraordinary effort that has so far succeeded in protecting our NHS and in saving many lives. And while our scientists have been zeroing in on the weaknesses of COVID, telescoping 10 years of work into 10 months, and now their endeavours are about to deliver the means, as I say, to rout the virus. Then that is clear. The government is backing not one potential vaccine, but 7. We've ordered 100 million doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that's now seeking regulatory approval. We've ordered 7 million doses of the Moderna vaccine, which has almost 95% effectiveness in trials. And, Mr. Speaker, we've ordered 40 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, which, if approved by the regulator, could start being administered before Christmas. In total, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, our vaccines task force has secured more than 350 million doses, more than enough for everyone in the UK, the Crown dependencies and our overseas territories. All we need to do now, Mr. Speaker, is to hold our nerve until these vaccines are indeed in our grasp and indeed being injected into our arms. So I say to the House again, let us follow the guidance, let us roll out mass testing, let's work to deliver mass testing to the people of our country, let's work together to control the virus, and it is in that spirit that I commend these regulations, Mr. Speaker. I commend these regulations to the House.
The question is that motion number 3 is on the order paper. Can I just say to members I will be introducing a 4-minute time limit, but I now go to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by welcoming the fall in infection numbers, the drop in the number of people being admitted to hospital, and crucially that the national R rate is now below 1. And below 1 in many parts of the country. That is very welcome news across the House. Before the lockdown, the infection rate was doubling every 2 weeks. The R number was above 1 in every part of England and rising, and the number of people in hospital was going up sharply across the country. In other words, the virus had been allowed to get out of control. And if anyone doubts that a lockdown was necessary, I would point out that since the 2nd of November, when this lockdown started, 10,711 people have tragically died within 28 days of testing positive for COVID-19. In the last week alone, that's an average of 460 deaths per day. That's appalling numbers, and every one is a tragedy. So we can argue about why this lockdown didn't happen earlier, when the infection rate was lower, as we argued for on this side of the House. But whatever view was taken of the timing, it's clear that the lockdown was necessary and has helped to reduce infections. Mr. Speaker, can I also welcome the progress on vaccines? I have nothing but admiration for our scientists and the amazing progress that's been made. And this is a great moment for our scientists. I myself went to Oxford University week before last to see the vaccine group there and to see the remarkable work that they were doing just before they announced their results. So a vaccine may now be in sight, and we must do everything we can to encourage take-up and make sure that it's rolled out quickly, fairly and safely. But, Mr. Speaker, the questions before this House today are these. How can we save as many lives and livelihoods as possible until we reach the light at the end of that tunnel? And are the measures that the Prime Minister has announced today going to control the virus and provide the right support to communities worst affected by these restrictions. Now, Labour has supported the government in 2 national lockdowns, and I recognise the need for continuing restrictions. And I do recognise that the tiers have been toughened, as it was obvious to everyone that the previous tiers were a one-way street to Tier 3. But I'm far from convinced by what the Prime Minister has said today. In particular, the economic package is nowhere near sufficient to support the communities most affected, and they've been suffering for many months. I'll just make some progress and I'll come back. I also fear that without the right health measures in place, in particular a working trace and isolate system, there are real risks that this plan is incapable of controlling the virus this winter. And I want to set that out in a bit more detail. Before I do so, I'll give way.
I'll thank the Leader of the Opposition. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that support for businesses, especially in Tier 3, who are struggling in the hospitality and in the arts sector in specifically, is just not enough because many of them are on the brink of collapse?
Just say to everybody in the chamber, with lots of speakers, those who are on early intervening is not fair to those later. People who aren't good to speak, I do understand, need to intervene. But please, let's think about each other. Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I do agree, and I'll come to the business support in a minute. But let me make the points in support of the case we make today. And the first point is this, that we've been here before. On the 10th of June, the Prime Minister told us for the first time of his whack-a-mole strategy to control local infections, the 10th of June. He told us it would be so effective that restrictions would only be for a few weeks or even a few days. That was far from reality. Leicester, for example, has just gone into the 154th day of restrictions, and by the time these regulations run out on the 2nd of February, Leicester will have been in restrictions for 217 days. So that didn't work, that 10th June proposal. I will in just 1 minute. Roll on to the 22nd of September. By now, infections rising in 19 of the 20 areas then under restrictions. The Prime Minister announced new restrictions, including the rule of 6. He stood and he told the House, and I quote, that the rule of 6, he said this, will curb the number of daily infections and reduce the reproduction rate to below 1. That's what he said about the rule of 6. So that didn't work. 2 weeks later, 12th of October, precise opposite happening, the Prime Minister stands up again, third time, introduces a 3-tier system. Again, he said this will work. He told the House this will deliver the reduction in the R rate locally and regionally that we need. That didn't work. 19 days later, 4th attempt now, a hurried press conference on a Saturday, the Prime Minister announced that the tier system had failed, the virus was out of control, and a national lockdown was now unavoidable. The reason this all matters, Mr. Speaker, because there's a pattern here. The Prime Minister's got a record of over-promising and under-delivering short-term decisions that then bump into the harsh reality of the virus. And then a new plan is conjured up a few weeks later. We're now on at least the 5th, with an even bigger promise that never materialises. Now, after 8 months, the Prime Minister should not be surprised that we and many of the British people are far less convinced this time round. I will give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, hugely. I have a biology degree, and I'm going to take a wild punt that I'm one of the few members of this House that actually used the word epidemiology in anger before January this year. We have choices to control this virus. We can have a lockdown, we can have a tiered system, or we can have no lockdown, where lives like John and Ken, who we've just recently lost in my family to this awful COVID, have happened. Why will the right honourable gentleman of the Labour Party not support these measures that are saving lives tonight?
Well, I'm grateful for that intervention. I'm setting out exactly why not, and I will take interventions along the way so that what I say can be challenged. But the first point is, which I've just finished, that we have been here before. This is at least plan number 5, and the first 4 haven't worked. So I think everybody would forgive the British public for being sceptical about the 5th plan. And I will go on to set out, because the second point I want to make is this. The public health risk of the Prime Minister's approach is significant. The prevalence of the virus remains high. Even if the R rate is below 1, it's only just below 1. And we know that the virus is at its most deadly during the cold winter months, exactly when the NHS is under the most strain. So if we're to keep the R rate below 1 during winter and not waste the progress that's been made in the last 4 weeks, we need to proceed with precision and caution. But instead of levelling with the British public, the Prime Minister has spent the weekend telling his backbenchers that the plan is all about, in his words, loosening restrictions across the country. And he's been fuelling a promise that within 2 weeks or so, local areas have a real prospect of dropping from tier 1, to a tier below the one that they're in. We need to level. In my view, that is highly unlikely. And we might as well face that now.
Will you give way?
It is obvious that the new tier 1 may slow, but it won't prevent a rise in infections, and is far from certain that the new tier 2 can hold the rate of infection. I hear the mutterings, but let's just see where we are in 2 weeks. And I look across the House to members across the House who think that perhaps in 2 weeks their area is going to drop down a tier just before Christmas. Let's see. This isn't hindsight. I'm telling you what's going to happen in 2 weeks. Now, we know where we will be. We know where we'll be in 2 weeks, and I've no doubt there'll be members on the opposite side getting up and saying, I thought my area was going to drop a tier just before Christmas. That's not levelling. That's not being straight, because that is not going to happen. Tier 1, the new tier 1 may slow the rate of infection, but it won't prevent it increasing. And tier 2 will struggle to hold the rate of infection. I hope it does. I hope I stand here and I'm wrong about this. And I think all members hope I'm wrong about it. But tier 2...
Order. Mrs. Ambrose, it's a continuous... We've had it for a few weeks now. Let's have a rest today. Keir Starmer.
Tier 2 crucially depends on all other factors falling into place at exactly the same time. And although everybody will welcome the chance to see our loved ones at Christmas, I'm not convinced the government's got a sufficiently robust plan in place to prevent a spike in infections over the new year. Now, of course, this is difficult, and all systems would have risk. But that brings me to my third point. The risks we face today, in the decisions we make today, are much higher because the Prime Minister has failed to fix the major problems with the now £22 billion track and trace system. Before the Prime Minister simply brushes the point aside again, let me remind him and the House that one of the major reasons that SAGE advised a circuit break back in September was because track and trace was only having, in their words, a marginal impact on transmission. So the great thing that was going to control the virus wasn't working then. And if we're to control this virus, that really matters. And the Prime Minister having his head in the sand isn't helping. Now, I know the Prime Minister will say we've made advances in testing. I recognise that, and I genuinely hope it helps to tackle the virus. But let me quote the Chief Scientific Officer, who said this: testing is important. Testing is important, but of course it only matters if people isolate as well. That's blindingly obvious. But only a fraction of people who should be self-isolating are doing so. And the Prime Minister still hasn't addressed the reasons for this, including the huge gaps in support. I know that there's been an announcement about the change of those notified by the app, a ridiculous submission in the first place, but it doesn't affect basic eligibility. Only 1 in 8 workers qualify for the one-off £500 self-isolation support. 1 in 8 qualify for that support. Anyone not receiving that has to rely on statutory sick pay, which is the equivalent of £13 a day. That is a huge problem that needs to be addressed. People want to do the right thing, but for many, there's a real fear that self-isolation means a huge loss of income that they simply can't afford. Now, I think, and I can't prove this, that one of the main reasons that people aren't passing on their contacts in the way we want is because they fear that those that they are passing on the contacts for won't be able to afford to self-isolate. That is a real problem, and we can't carry on ignoring it. I will.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is doing a very good job. It's his job to criticise the government. And of course mistakes have been made, but a credible opposition has a plan of its own. What is the plan of the Labour Party?
Yeah. Your second bite of the cherry is other people as well, please. Just stop.
I'll come to that, but I need to... I've accepted the case for restrictions. We were very clear about the need for a circuit break. We need to go into restrictions, but we need a scheme that works. And I'm explaining what the problem is with this scheme as we go through it. Because let me stay with track and trace. Let me stay with track and trace, because we know the claims the Prime Minister made about this at the beginning of the year and the middle of the year. Because on tracing, crucial, tracing, the latest figures show 137,000 close contacts were missed by the system in 1 week. That's the highest weekly figure yet. This is not a figure that's going down. It's a figure that's going up. That means that over 500,000 close contacts have been missed by the system in the last month. That's not a statistic. That's 500,000 people who should have been self-isolating, but instead of self-isolating, they were with their friends, their families, and their communities. 500,000 people in 1 month. That is a huge gap in the defences. I raise this every week. The Prime Minister pretends it's getting better, but it never does. The Prime Minister has almost given up on this now and put mass testing in its place. Again, blind optimism, not a plan. But the idea that we can go through the next few months and successfully keep the virus under control when 500,000 people a month are wandering around when they should be self-isolating is not a sensible plan going forward. My fourth point is to come to the level of economic support that's provided. I have to say to the Prime Minister, it's hard to overstate the level of anger there is about this out there in our communities, many of whom have been in restrictions for months on end. Yesterday, I did a virtual visit to the Northwest, to local businesses there. Their emotions range from deep disappointment of the government to raw anger that the Prime Minister and Chancellor just aren't listening and don't get the impact of months of endless restrictions and the impact they've had on local communities. In March, the Prime Minister vowed the Chancellor vowed to do whatever it takes to support households and businesses. But there's now been 6 economic plans in 9 months, and the level of support is still insufficient. For these reasons, and let me spell them out, the Prime Minister mumbles. Let me spell out. First, the scheme doesn't fairly reflect the difficulties faced in businesses across the country. I'd be surprised if members' offices aren't picking this up from their constituents and businesses. Let me start with the additional restrictions grant, which gives a flat figure to local areas regardless of how long they've been in restrictions. So that means Greater Manchester, which will be on its 40th day of severe restrictions when it enters Tier 3 tomorrow, has received the same one-off support as the Isle of Wight, which went into restrictions far later and will emerge tomorrow into Tier 1. That is unfair, and everybody knows it's unfair, and everybody in this House is being told by their constituents and by their businesses that it's unfair. So to pretend it isn't there just isn't real, Prime Minister. The second aspect, I'll come to that aspect, the second aspect is this. The grant doesn't take account of the number of businesses that need support in each area. So our great cities are being asked to spread the same sum far more thinly. And that's also clearly unfair. Our constituents know it's unfair. Our businesses know it's unfair. And nothing has been done about it. The third aspect, even allowing for today's announcement on pubs, which I think is the definition of small beer, many businesses are now receiving less support than they did during the first wave. That's a huge strain for businesses, particularly those that have been so long under restrictions. And it makes no economic sense for the government to allow them to go to the wall. The second, putting the grant system on one side, the second major point about the economic support is this, that millions of self-employed people remain unfairly excluded from the government support schemes. Again, there's nothing that's been done about this. I've raised it so many times with the Prime Minister, so have others. Every time he chooses to talk about those that are within the scheme, ignoring those that are not in the scheme. This is 8 months on, and we're facing another 3 or 4 months of this, which means 12 months without the support that's needed in those areas. I will.
Extremely grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. He talks about those people who have been excluded from support and focusing in on who those people are. They include people who set up their own businesses 18 months ago, directors of very small limited companies, taxi drivers, hairdressers and the like. These are the entrepreneurs we need to build Britain back as we recover from the economic wreckage of the coronavirus. Does he agree with me? We should be investing in those people, not excluding them and leaving many of them in deep and dangerous debt.
I do, and their cry still hasn't been heard. Now, I accept that in putting together a support package in a hurry back in March, there may have been reasons why certain groups were overlooked. But this is 8 months on. This has been pointed out over and over again. And here we go into a tiered system, and there's still that gap in the system, and it's being very strongly felt out there. The third point about the economic package is this, that the government must remove the uncertainty about furlough and rule out changing the scheme again in January. This is crucial because businesses are beginning to make decisions about what they do in January. The Chancellor made this mistake before. By the time the furlough was extended, many businesses had laid people off because it came too late. We know what happens in this circumstance. The uncertainty has already caused real economic damage, and we can't afford the same mistake again. So taken together, the business and economic support just doesn't stack up. I want to make a wider point about the economic damage that this pandemic and the government have done to our economy. Last week's autumn statement laid bare the huge and worsening economic cost of the crisis. I know that there are those that say, well, that's the reason to end restrictions. But the reality is you can't protect the economy if you lose control of the virus. That just leads to more uncertainty, more restrictions, and more long-term damage to the economy. And it's the failure to get control of the virus or take a long-term approach to shielding our economy that's left the UK with the worst economic recession of the G7 and the highest death toll in Europe. The fifth reason for scepticism about the government's approach is this: managing and priorities. The last 48 hours have been a summary of the mistakes the government's made in this crisis. The Prime Minister is fatally split between appeasing his backbenchers and following the science, and he's ending up pleasing nobody. I think the Prime Minister knows that tough restrictions are now needed, but he pretends that the restrictions might not be in place for very long. He pretends that it's quite possible that everybody will be in a lower tier in 2 weeks' time. The reality is that tough restrictions will be needed until the vaccine is rolled out. That may be months away. The Prime Minister will doubtless be back in a few weeks with another plan, but the Prime Minister doesn't make that case today or provide the certainty or the consistency that we need. So in the last 48 hours, we've had concessions, letters and promises to his MPs, not clear and reliable messaging to the public, and that's symptomatic of the problem. Mr. Speaker, coronavirus remains a serious threat to the public's health, to our economy and to our way of life. We recognise the need for continued restrictions, but it's not in the national interest to vote these restrictions down today, and we will allow these restrictions to pass. But it's another wasted... Well, we accept the case for restrictions. We want a plan that's going to work. We're on Plan 5, and this one's full of holes. We have been there so many times. So many times the Prime Minister stood there and said, this is the plan, this is the plan, this will solve the problem. Fifth time round, still a plan, with holes that have been there for months and still not closed. Why is track and trace still not working? Why are the gaps in the support still there? Why are those that are excluding not included? Why are those that have to self-isolate not given the support to do so? These are huge gaps in the system, and to simply vote through a plan without recognising those problems is not going to help. Now, I accept the case for restrictions. We will not stand in the way of these regulations. We do not want the restrictions to come off, but I'm not going to stand here and pretend, as the Prime Minister does, that this is the plan that's going to solve it all, vote for this, and it'll all be fine through to Easter. That is not going to happen, and nobody should vote on that basis today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have to say that while there are many points of merit that the Right Honourable Gentleman has just raised, he's left the House and the public with the impression that he is happy for these restrictions to go through, he just won't vote for them. And I think that the idea that that's the kind of atmosphere that the public wants or will encourage the public to comply and to cooperate when there is disagreement between the main parties on these fundamental issues that can't be resolved in a sensible way, I think the public will be disappointed with that. And I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm grateful. Well, there might be a different interpretation of the events that have just passed, mightn't there? Which is that a lot of us are very concerned that the Prime Minister doesn't give the full story to the House and to the nation. The truth is, we're almost certainly going to see another lockdown in January, aren't we? A full lockdown across the whole of the United Kingdom. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I hear the Prime Minister say it's not what we want. Nobody wants any of this. Of course we don't, but we have to be honest and straightforward with the British people. And these measures today are not sufficient to the day.
I didn't hear my right honourable friend make the promise that he is suggesting that he made. I think my right honourable friend is being perfectly honest with the House on this. I think it's very difficult. I'll come to the point. But I want to concentrate on what we agree about. We all agree we want to keep the R rate below 1 while minimising the restrictions on people's lives and limiting the economic damage. If the R rate rises above 1, then this becomes much too difficult to predict and control. It has a multiplying effect even if the R rate remains constant. And it's perfectly legitimate for colleagues on this side to press the government for more clarity about why the government believes the NHS is at risk of being overwhelmed. Data for much of the country does not suggest that at the moment. But it's not uncommon for hospitals to become overrun during the winter months. That's without the addition of COVID. It's also reasonable for government to fear that the rising rate of COVID infections would lead to exactly that in some areas, or much worse, unless we can keep the R number around or below 1. And that's all that these measures can be expected to achieve. It's right to press the government for more analysis of the economic impact of these measures, but maybe the government was wrong to raise the expectation that they could provide this degree of certainty where so much uncertainty exists. Equally, it must be agreed it is impossible to predict the economic consequences of a rapid spread of the virus. And I understand the frustration of representing a low virus constituency but included in a tier 2 area, and the need to provide the right support to business being badly hit. But these are not about alternatives to the fundamentals of this policy, which I believe the opposition is trying to avoid. The real question is, and it's also a legitimate question, is will these tiers be enough? I hope tier 2 will keep Essex below the R1, but there is doubt. Tier 2 did not work before. We must look upon this period as a further period of transition to when vaccines will begin to become available. We should look ahead at the challenges the vaccine programmes will present and give thought to how we will provide reassurance that the vaccine that you are being invited to accept is right for you. And in the meantime, the challenge is to ensure that we can move down the tiers, not just into tier 1, but to remain in tier 1, even if the vaccines take time to become effective and at scale. And this will depend upon how we all behave and the example that we set and what we do to encourage confidence and cooperation with test and trace operations. There is much to ask the government which time does not allow today about how to improve trace and isolate operations, particularly at local level, and about how the community volunteer hubs could help support people who should isolate. That is vital work now. The last thing I want is to vote for these restrictions today, but until there are better alternatives, we have no alternative and should support them. And I'm sorry that Her Majesty's opposition are trying to avoid that truth. The government has also the opportunity to learn by continuing to listen and to gain public confidence from that.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The motions before the House do relate exclusively to England, but that doesn't mean they don't have consequences across these islands, and so it is important, I think, that the voice of the Scottish National Party is heard in this debate. Although, in line with our long-standing practice as regards matters that are devolved, we won't take part in any division this evening, and I'm sure that's of some assistance to the Government Whip's office. And perhaps the first thing the Government needs to consider is why it has got to that stage. Scotland has passed similar, but not identical, regulations with a far greater degree of cross-party and intra-party consensus than seems to have been managed here in Westminster. And perhaps that's because the First Minister and her Cabinet Secretaries and the senior public health officials have always taken a commendably frank and honest approach with the people of Scotland about the challenges of the virus and the difficulty of the decisions that have to be made. In the summertime, the First Minister initiated a national dialogue with people across Scotland on what a roadmap out of the initial lockdown should and could look like. Instead of promising moonshots and world-beating systems and that it would all be over by Christmas, the Scottish Government and the other devolved governments have worked to take people with them, whether that's the public at large or whether it's their own backbenchers. And we've always been clear that public health and saving lives has to be the priority. Whatever the pain, and there is real pain caused to the economy and livelihoods by these kind of restrictions, that pain is as nothing to a life ended too soon, to a family or a community bereaved by this dreadful disease. And as always, the Scottish National Party sends its deepest sympathies to all those who have lost a loved one as a result of the pandemic. But that's not to minimise the impact and effects of the economic pain. I see it firsthand in Glasgow North, which thrives on the hospitality and entertainment and events sector, and will be interested to find out what the consequences of the government's announcement today about support for pubs will be north of the border. My constituency is home to thousands of creatives, of start-ups, of entrepreneurs who have all been left behind, forgotten, excluded from the Chancellor's support package. We hear the impact from the families genuinely terrified that the £20 universal credit uplift will not be extended beyond March, and from those on legacy benefits who have yet to see a similar uplift. And we all feel the struggle of the frontline public sector workers busting a gut to keep the services that we all depend on going in the most difficult of circumstances. And support for all of these groups, and for those who need to isolate, which is absolutely critical to stopping the virus. In support for these groups, the government has been found wanting, and the Prime Minister was chuntering to the Leader of the Opposition, saying, how do we get people to self-isolate? Well, as he said, start by paying a decent rate of statutory sick pay. Make it affordable for people to stay at home and stay safe. And perhaps if the government had made more effort to support those people, to support the excluded, to support families who are struggling, then it wouldn't be feeling the heat that it is now from its own backbenches. And we just, Madam Deputy Speaker, need to compare that to what we've heard in the last few days in Scotland. A £500 bonus for all NHS and social care staff. For 10 weeks, we all clapped for carers, but that was never going to be enough. And this is a gesture of thanks for extraordinary service. And I really hope the Prime Minister and the Chancellor will have the decency not to level tax on this well-deserved reward. And for the families who need it most, a £100 one-off payment before Christmas to households with children in receipt of free school meals. And a commitment that all primary children will receive free meals, breakfast and lunch, at school and all year round if the SNP is re-elected next year. That's the difference that devolution makes. For NHS workers and families in receipt of these payments, that's not a disaster. That's a Scottish Government working for and delivering for their best interests and the interests of our society as a whole. And if it means that we are using our share of money that the UK Treasury has borrowed on Scotland's behalf, well, that's the point of devolution. And if the Tories don't like it, and I hear some chuntering, the solution is very simple. Independence for Scotland would have meant we could have raised our own finance on our own terms and spent it on our priorities in our own time. And we certainly would have had to wait for the south east of England to be placed into lockdown before the furlough scheme was extended across the whole of the UK. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, if the Prime Minister is feeling pressure from his own side today, he only has himself to blame. Real leadership is about being able to make the hard choices and be honest with people when mistakes are made, especially in a time of crisis. People don't want bluster and false hope. They want honesty and determination and empathy. The devolved governments have always sought a four nations approach wherever possible, and we've seen that agreement can be reached in the provisions being made for those who need to travel to see loved ones over Christmas. And while that period of easing will be welcomed by many, all of us will have an extra responsibility to be extra vigilant, to minimise risk, to practice social distance, our good hand hygiene, wearing our face coverings, and all the other steps that we've become familiar with. But that familiarity cannot become complacency. The threat of the virus to overwhelm our health service, to undermine the economy and to individual lives across the country has not gone away. So while we welcome the light at the end of the tunnel as vaccines come online, that light must be approached slowly and carefully. So that's why Scotland will continue with its tier system and the difficult decisions that we need until the virus is beaten. The other devolved nations are making similar decisions, and members representing England in this place have a responsibility to do likewise.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I say at the outset that I think the Prime Minister's instincts in this matter are not so different from mine, and I recognise the difficulty and the burden that he carries. This is a difficult matter, and there are difficult decisions to take. Freedom, Madam Deputy Speaker, is not an absolute, but it should be regarded as precious. And it should be always the strongest possible presumption in its favour. If government is to take away fundamental liberties of the people whom we represent, they must demonstrate beyond question that they are acting in a way that is both proportionate and absolutely necessary. Today, Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe the government has failed to make that compelling case. The benefit of the doubt that this House has extended to government in March and since is harder to take for granted in December. Madam Deputy Speaker, 6 weeks ago, many of us made the case that the curfew policy at 10 p.m. was not just unnecessary, but that it was counterproductive. Today, the government apparently agrees that the 10 p.m. curfew makes no sense. A month ago, the government insisted that golf and tennis and bowls and gyms were unsafe. Now, it seems that they are not. Madam Deputy Speaker, before the second lockdown, I invited the House to consider whether government had the right to make it illegal for people to see their children, their grandchildren, or their elderly relatives. Whether government had the right to ban collective worship, or to take away the right to work to support your family. Different people, different members of this House, will draw the line in different places. But we must all accept that these are fundamental freedoms of our constituents, and we should insist on compelling evidence before we allow them to be compromised. That is why, Madam Deputy Speaker, I asked for an impact assessment a month ago, and also for a transparent publication of the criteria that would be used to decide in which tier our constituents would be placed, but also, crucially, the weighting that would be applied to each of those criteria. Madam Deputy Speaker, my constituents in the Borough of Trafford have been placed unfairly in Tier 3, in spite of COVID test figures that are well below the average for England. Currently, the rate is 127.7 per 100,000 and falling rapidly. But I looked in vain at the document published late yesterday for any explanation or any route being set out as to how we would reach that low tier. There was no serious attempt in that document to provide an answer. In the absence of that serious and compelling case, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have no choice but to oppose these measures.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would say to the Right Honourable Gentleman for Altrincham and Sale West that this debate is indeed about freedom, but it's also about the balance of risks and costs. The risks to life and the costs to businesses and families, which are both substantial and deeply worrying to every single member of this House. But it's also a debate about facts. What are the facts? And here we know that our debate in this country, and indeed across the world, about how to handle this epidemic is disputed by some. And it is a dispute in which the truth and the uncertainty, because some of this is all about scientific uncertainty, wrestle with the plainly false. And it is about the impact of that on vaccination that I want to say a few words today. For months now, we have lived through restrictions. We have seen people die. We have seen our local businesses suffer. And from time to time, we have lifted our eyes to the horizon in the hope of glimpsing something that is a bit better. Well, something has now appeared. To use a seasonal analogy, in the dark winter sky, there are 3 new stars have appeared, and they are the 3 new vaccines which have been developed and are awaiting approval. And as has been said already, every single one of us owes an enormous debt of gratitude to the scientists and the volunteers who took part, and to all of the people in the NHS, local authorities, our forces and others, who, as we speak, are making preparation for the mass vaccination programme to come. But that too is disputed by some people, although I think it's really important, Madam Deputy Speaker, we distinguish between the conspiracy theorist anti-vaxxers on the one hand and those who have genuine questions and concerns on the other. Now, it may seem incredible to every single one of us that there are people who believe those conspiracy theories, one of which apparently is that governments wish to inject us all with microchips. Given the problems there have been with handling other aspects of the epidemic, I don't think any government of the world would have the capability to do that. It is, of course, complete nonsense, but more seriously, we remember the huge anxiety that was caused by the false claim that autism was caused by the MMR vaccine. Now, that study was eventually discredited, the doctor responsible struck off, but the damage had been done, and the anti-vax conspiracy theorists are still touting their lethal wares around the internet. The fact is that vaccination has saved millions and millions of lives since Edward Jenner developed the first successful vaccine in 1796. And in the last 30 years, vaccination against polio has almost eradicated that terrible disease. There are just 2 countries left in the world where it still exists, Pakistan and Afghanistan, and that is in part down to some people who have killed brave health workers who were only trying to save the lives of children. And therefore, anything and everything, and I say this to the Health Secretary, that can be done to take on those who spread falsehoods will have the full support of this House. But it is also a fact that there are people who have genuine questions and concerns, and I just say it's really important that we provide as much information as possible so people can weigh up the facts, talk to their GPs and make a decision. Now, I welcome the decision that vaccination will not be compulsory. It should not be compulsory. But nor should we forget that it is both a fact and the truth that the more of us who are vaccinated, the better the chance we have of defeating this disease. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, subject to the regulators saying they are safe, I, for one, will be queuing with my sleeve rolled up when the time comes.
David Davis.
The right honourable gentleman leaves me with an interesting image to start my speech. Let's look at the facts, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government tells us that this is all about protecting the National Health Service. Fine. So let's start with the hard UK numbers. The number of COVID-19 patients in hospitals reached a peak of 16,612 in the UK out of 127,000 hospital beds nationwide a week or 2 ago. Number of patients in critical care beds reached a peak of 1,489 with a UK-wide capacity of at least 4,500. And at the recent peak of the virus, the National Health Service had 13,000 free hospital beds and 18% of critical care beds free, which is better than it usually is at this time of year, significantly better. So cause for concern because of the potential growth of the virus, but not cause for panic. Now, the government undoubtedly has to act, but it should do so on the basis of hard facts. What we're talking about today, of course, is what the government thinks of as a localised lockdown, tiers 1, 2 and 3. But we know from other studies around the world, other countries around the world, what does work and what does not. We don't have to guess. There's actually hard evidence. Some of the select committees have covered that hard evidence. What does work is very, very narrowly targeted interventions with intensive testing and tracking of contacts and highly localised lockdowns. Take Germany, who have their fair share of densely populated areas, but have a death rate of 1/4 of ours. Their concept of a local lockdown may be at its biggest, the city of Gütersloh, with a population of 101,000, or Warendorf, 37,000, or one meatpacking factory, 7,000, or even one block of flats, 700 people. That's what they think of as a localised lockdown. Compare that to us. We locked down Liverpool City region, 1.5 million. Greater Manchester, 2.8 million. Yorkshire and Humber, 4.7 million. Anything but a precise lockdown. Other countries as well, like South Korea and Vietnam, have used a similarly targeted approach to contain the virus with spectacularly better results than we have achieved. South Korea has just 10 deaths per million of population. Vietnam is even more successful, with about half a death per million of population. Now, these measures will undoubtedly go through today, but I will not be voting for them. When we come to vote on them, I'll expect that next time, in early February, according to the Prime Minister, I will hope they'll be massively more targeted. Restrictions on a local authority level, which we have now, is not enough. We must follow the example of Germany, South Korea and others by having restrictions imposed on a much smaller area. They work better, they're fairer, and they cause much less economic damage. We don't know for sure whether blanket lockdown restrictions work to suppress the virus. But what we do know for sure is the economic damage caused by such restrictions. The impact on people's livelihoods and even their mental health is absolutely clear. As my honourable friend, the Chairman of 22, said earlier, in this country we do not give up our freedoms lightly. What we need today is a policy of maximum protection for minimum damage. This policy is not it, and I hope the next iteration in February does a much better job.
Graham Stringer.
It's a pleasure to follow the right honourable gentleman. I have to say I agree with him, and I will be voting against these regulations this evening. But he has persuaded me to change what I was going to say by the power of his speech, because we don't have to look to Germany and Vietnam to see what it is necessary to do. We have to look at 200 years of public health in this country, which has always been done at a local level. And one of the problems with the systems that the government have followed, like all governments, they want to centralise things. They want to take control. And it is not just the fact that people suffer financially and won't isolate themselves. It is that the central system is so slow at getting the information out to people that they need to isolate, that by the time it's got there, the £22 billion or whatever we've spent on it has been wasted. It's gone. The information is useless. And in actual fact, we have also seen evidence that Public Health England have withheld information from local public health authorities. So if we want, when we come back in 2 months' time, to get it right, we must decentralise the expenditure and get it into local public health systems. What I was going to say before the right honourable gentleman spoke was that there isn't a way forward where people don't die in this situation. That's tragic, and everybody in this House wants to minimise the number of deaths. But we sometimes speak as though if we have the most restrictive measures, which will undoubtedly stop people contracting COVID, that will be fine. It's not. The first lockdown led to people dying from cancer as cancer services were withdrawn. People didn't go to hospitals, and if they did go to hospitals, they often didn't get treatment. The number of people dying at home increased dramatically over that period. So the proposals before us today will lead to more of that, a withdrawal of the health services from some people. They will be extraordinarily damaging to the economy of Greater Manchester and other parts of the United Kingdom economy. And remember, poverty kills. It's not just cancer and COVID that kills, poverty kills. People commit suicide. Children who have had their education withdrawn, suicide rates amongst children are up by 40%. So there is huge damage done across the board. And if we look at the basis of the decisions, people say that it's been informed by the science. Well, I can't see that. When we had the Secretary of State for Health before the Joint Committees of Health and Science on the 23rd of November, and we asked him about what criteria he was going to use to determine which areas went into which tier. He couldn't tell us. Has there been a cost-benefit analysis? He could tell us because Greater Manchester leaders told him that he'd got his figures wrong, that in effect, he didn't use the word punish, but in effect, Greater Manchester was going to be punished for taking time to put him right on the science and the detail of what was happening in Greater Manchester. When it came to consider, I will give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I want to help him with his time, but just to say to him this, that the science is not the same as the opinion of a single scientist.
I couldn't agree more. And one can go right away from the Barrington Group to the people advising the government. If you have science to send a rocket to the moon, it is exact. The science on epidemics is not exact. It is open to different opinions. What I was going to finish on, I think the Secretary of State showed his prejudice against Greater Manchester, and the proposals he's put forward will wreak economic havoc on Greater Manchester. And we are told, although we clearly weren't present, that when the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster was making his proposals to lock down London, the Prime Minister, ex-Mayor of London, said, no, you can't do that, it will cost 500,000 jobs. And what that means to me is this government are valuing jobs in London over jobs in Manchester and elsewhere in the country.
Andrea Leadsom.
Madam Deputy Speaker, on Bonfire Night, normally a superb family occasion, this House locked down our nation for the second time, inflicting great damage on the livelihoods, the mental health and the well-being of our constituents, all in the interests of the greater good. I reluctantly supported that lockdown, but made clear to my whip that I would not vote for any extension unless it was made clear to me why such an extension would be the lesser of all evils. And I'm afraid the document provided by the government yesterday does little to address my concerns and therefore doesn't allow me to reassure my constituents. It deals with the here and now. It doesn't provide an analysis of the long-term impact on people's lives, nor does it explain why South Northamptonshire must be in Tier 2. There's no analysis of the counterfactual, i.e. what would happen if there was no lockdown and people were given sound advice rather than forced in law to comply. And here, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a fundamental concern. We already know that compliance is a serious issue in some places and sectors. There are lots of jokes circulating about how you can eat a substantial Scotch egg with your pint in the pub, but not a bag of pork scratchings. And how different households meeting inside a restaurant will be rebranding their party as a business gathering. But in fact, these are very serious. What they graphically illustrate is that those with the nous and desire to get around the rules will do so, and those who are more compliant will suffer the frustration of seeing others flouting the rules that they themselves do not break. I have many concerns. A constituent told me recently that she finds it unbelievable that a mixed group of tradesmen can work in an enclosed space, one of them being her own husband, and yet she's been unable to see her daughter indoors in their spacious sitting room, even though she would, of course, take extra special care. How is this fair or logical? Just yesterday I was speaking to primary school head teachers who raised with me their grave concern that they are on their knees working to ensure every child can be in school, but they're finding other services unavailable to them, such as child psychology assessments and supervision for non-resident parents, who all seem to be only sporadically available and never in person. How is this fair or logical? And then last week, I held a meeting of my South Northants Business Club, talking to small businesses who are flat out trying to survive and preserve their life's work. One is a golf and hotel complex that is still unable to provide a service compared to the big fast food chains who can outcompete through takeaways and deliveries. Another, a wedding events organiser with a beautiful stone barn that can seat up to 80, completely socially distanced. But their facility is for weddings and events rather than a licensed restaurant, so they can't open. How is this fair or logical? And then there's the long-term health implications. My great fear is that my constituents are not accessing healthcare as they don't want to bother anyone. And speaking to GPs in my patch, they share that fear. And what will the long-term mental health impact be of this year's tsunami of loneliness, in particular for those with memory loss, for whom this isolation has been so disastrous, and those who've had a baby in lockdown, who've been isolated with virtually no face-to-face help? I was concerned on the 5th of November, and I remain so today. So my final questions to the government are, why are we going back into the tiering systems? Did the lockdown work or didn't it? And what are the merits of the ongoing constraints on my constituents versus the ongoing visible costs to them? I want to support my government and my Prime Minister in the lobby this evening, but I can't and won't inflict deliberate harm on my constituency unless I can see for myself that to do nothing would be worse.
Tanmanjeet Singh Desai.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this very important debate, which will have a huge impact on my Slough constituents and those across the country who face the prospect of entering Tier 3 tomorrow. Since restrictions began in March, we have all made huge sacrifices to curb the spread of this deadly virus, which I know from personal experience can be devastating. We have all accepted that we have a role to play to protect those who are more vulnerable to this virus, and we have all seen the impact this virus has had on communities up and down the country, especially those who are elderly, from more disadvantaged background, or those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. As we leave our second national lockdown this year, we must recognise we are where we are because the previous three-tier system did not work. Nobody wants a repeat of that. We must ensure that the new system protects lives, supports businesses, and no area is left behind. The system which has been proposed, sadly, does not achieve this. Despite the excellent work of our local Slough Borough Council, public health teams and volunteers, Slough's current high weekly infection rate has placed us in a very high alert tier. It is right that with high coronavirus numbers, stricter measures should be implemented to protect lives. However, it was to my absolute astonishment upon checking nearby areas that Slough was a dot of red in a sea of orange tier 2s. Despite committing to a regional approach, Slough has been made a special case, segregated from the rest of Berkshire County and the wider region. It appears based on an arbitrary political decision and an anomaly nationwide. Areas in Essex, London and Surrey all have local authorities with comparable, if not higher, infection rates to my Slough constituency, yet similar action has not been taken. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the tiered system to work, it must be consistently applied and based on scientific evidence. Yet at a time when we need fairness, clarity and transparency, all we have is confusion and mixed messaging. This is particularly detrimental for businesses who under normal circumstances would often be heading into the busiest period of the year, and they are now faced with no clear plan or adequate support from the government. I have been contacted by hundreds of Slough constituents concerned about the impact Tier 3 restrictions will have on their livelihoods without increased support. Businesses in the dark, eligibility issues around the self-isolation support payment, inadequate support that does not reflect business need or length of time under each tier. The government has had months to prepare and fix the many issues which Labour have been consistently highlighting. Back in October, Madam Deputy Speaker, prior to our month-long lockdown, I called upon the Prime Minister to fix our test, track and trace system and hand responsibility from Serco to local public health teams who know their area. Yet the government is just not listening and continues to fail us. And the budget now is at a staggering £22 billion, more than the annual budget for the police and fire services combined. And in the last few seconds that I've got, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say that we need much more funding and resources for our local public health teams. And with each day of government incompetence, lives and livelihoods are put at risk. And despite the doubts about these new proposals, I sincerely hope that they, along with the excellent news of a vaccine on the horizon, that with that things vastly improve, or are fair that we will be headed to further lockdowns in the future.
Damien Green.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise with some sadness to oppose this motion, as I recognise the hugely difficult decisions ministers have to make and the many successes that my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary and his team have brought about in recent months. But as the first member from Kent to be called in this debate, I'd be failing my constituents if I didn't register a strong protest about the way the tiers have been applied in a fashion which to many people feels arbitrary. I should say, of course, I don't share the views of those who think any restrictions are unnecessary, still less those who think this is part of some great conspiracy. What I want to see is a balanced and effective approach to saving lives and jobs. I reject the idea that you have to choose between lives and livelihoods. Of course we will save more jobs if we control the virus as fast as possible. And it's reckless and inhumane to argue that the deaths of older people is something we should just put up with. But to be as effective as possible, the new tiered system needs wide public consent. In the end, we're all responsible for our own actions. So I want to see a system that encourages the most people to obey the rules for the largest amount of time. I put to the Prime Minister last week the thoughts of a constituent who said that if the government imposes stupid rules, people will stop obeying the sensible rules as well. This was sadly dismissed. Since then, the national debate has moved on to how big a Scotch egg has to be to constitute a substantial meal. I rest my case. I'm afraid what we have before us today fails the test of maximising voluntary public support. To be specific, it certainly does in my constituency, where I've had the most angry emails over a weekend since the Dominic Cummings trip to Barnard Castle. The problem for us is the sheer size of Kent and the huge disparity of rates of infection between different parts of the county. There are rural areas in the southwest of the county which have very low rates, which are many miles from the areas in the northeast of the county, where rates are indeed alarmingly high and which absolutely need to be in Tier 3. I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for his indications earlier on this, but they are not yet quite a commitment. I don't believe in simply whinging, so we have suggested an alternative route to ministers. We've said that instead of putting an entire county or region into a particular tier, we should do it on a borough or district basis. I hope that this idea is indeed being seriously considered in government now. One advantage of this approach would be that it would be more flexible for ministers to decide to move areas between tiers. So this would give people some hope, given that only 1% of the population is in Tier 1, that they might have more of their normal life restored quickly. Two more points. First, from my constituency point of view, what was the point of the second lockdown? The national figures are pointing in the right direction, but we entered it in Tier 1 and leave it in Tier 3. That's a puzzle for a successful policy. But if that's puzzling, even more so is why it seems to have worked in every part of the country except North East Kent. Genuinely, why is that? And secondly, I would urge ministers to spend a lot of time and effort between now and Christmas urging people to be ultra cautious in the 5-day exemption period. We seem to accept as inevitable that there will be another spike in January because of Christmas. I very, very much hope that won't happen, because if we do, we'll have exchanged a weekend of fun for a long winter of regret to follow. We can now see the glimpses of normal life resuming with the vaccine and regular quick testing. For us to reach that promised land as quickly as possible, the public needs to give their full assent to the new measures. I very much hope the government will come forward with some that do reach that public assent, but these proposals, I'm afraid, don't achieve that, so I'll be voting against them.
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Lancashire is an awful long way from Kent, but as I follow the Honourable Gentleman, there are many parallels in the experiences I had this weekend to the experiences that he described with his constituents as well. Because tomorrow my Lancaster and Fleetwood constituency, along with the whole of Lancashire, goes into Tier 3 restrictions. However, from the outset, I do want to stress that I do support necessary measures to protect public health, but those measures must have support from local communities, buy-in from local leaders, and support package for our local economies that mean that the regulations are actually respected by local communities. And it struck me that the Honourable Gentleman from Kent there described, paraphrased one of his constituents saying that when the rules are stupid, why should we follow them? And I feel like I spent my weekend hearing from constituents who say it's unfair that Lancaster and Fleetwood has been placed into Tier 3 restrictions when the infection rates are far lower than the vast majority of London boroughs, which end up in Tier 2, that are lower infection rates than neighbouring district councils like South Lakeland, which is in Tier 2, as is the whole of Cumbria. And when my constituents see an unfairness and a discrepancy into how these tiers are applied, the kickback tends to be, well, why should I follow them? And I've been very clear as a Member of Parliament that my constituents should follow the regulations in Tier 3. I don't feel it's fair that they've been put into those restrictions. However, it's important that we follow those restrictions in order to ensure that infection rates do come down. And I just want to set out, a state of health picture because I'm very grateful to University Hospitals Morecambe Bay Trust for setting out such a clear and open picture of how my local hospitals are doing. And I wanted to stress that these are running totals and not validated data. But as of last night, we'd had 317 deaths since the start of the pandemic in the area. We currently have 3 wards closed at the local hospital, and bed occupancy at the Royal Lancaster Infirmary as of last night was running at 98%. I understand the seriousness of this health crisis and this pandemic, and all of this is having an impact on regular and scheduled operations as well. But the government really must set out how they believe that these restrictions are going to be effective and fair, because right now the second wave is having a disproportionate impact on the north, and particularly when it comes to local businesses who have made very clear representations to me as a local Member of Parliament that the £20 a head business support grant, which is a one-off payment to our local authorities, have to stretch for the length of time that we're in these Tier 3 restrictions, which means for the communities like mine in Lancashire, that money has to stretch for the same length of time as, say, Cornwall, which was placed in Tier 1 restrictions, just had to make it last for 28 days. And when it comes to local economy, my constituents are quite frankly really annoyed to read reports in papers like the Sunday Times that the economy of London was taken into consideration when the decision was made to place London into Tier 2. However, when it comes to the economy in the north of England, that was not taken into consideration as one of the 5 factors. That stinks of one rule for the south and for London and another rule for the north, and that is not the message that the government ought to be bringing if they need to bring local communities and local leaders along with them in order for these restrictions to be enforced. And I just want to stress finally that in Lancashire we had a cross-party consensus from the Conservative-run County Council to Labour district councils to MPs like myself. They would have made sense to look at Lancashire district by district rather than county-wide when it's such a diverse county that looks in very many directions. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Adam Holloway.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I'd like to pay tribute to the continued amazing performance of NHS staff and indeed the government and Kate Bingham's team for these incredible developments over the vaccines. And I don't underplay the difficult and complex decisions being made by people in government and, of course, the terrible toll on families affected. But it seems to me with every difficulty and milestone reached, it strikes me that the government are acting on largely uncontested information. It feels like there's been a serious lack of diversity of opinion, analysis and evidence in many of these restrictions. The COVID Recovery Group don't want to let it rip. They just ask for proper economic impact assessments. For example, let's take the hospitality industry, where we're talking about using an enormous amount of taxpayers' money to pay them to not open or to pay people not to go to work. But these payments will go nowhere near
the losses of these businesses, and many of them, despite that, will still go to the wall. Why are we looking at not keeping them open, given the very limited evidence for closing them? Prior to this latest lockdown, I joked with the proprietor of the Compass Ale House in Gravesend that going into his place was like being, put under his control. Stand there, scan here, anti-back your hands, walk along that path, sit down there, etc. You get the picture. The point is, the hospitality industry has spent an absolute fortune and have thought long and hard about how to run their establishments safely. We should be reopening well-run pubs and restaurants like the Reliance Fish Bar and Bartella's in Mepham, and we should absolutely, the authorities should be merciless in closing and fining pubs that risk NHS capacity. I'd much rather my constituents socialise in well-run venues than squeeze onto the sofa back at home with their friends. I'd have thought that mixing in venues was much better than mixing at home in tiers 2 and 3. I'd have thought that encouraging personal responsibility was rather better than nuances about how much you've got to eat with your beer. We must make sure that, as others have said, restrictions make sense, or we will actually drive down compliance. We've got to have a bit more diversity in the advice. Perhaps there should be a few more people with private sector experience, perhaps even some more diverse scientific voices. I don't understand why we're using infection rates and not ITU occupancy to guide policy, and why can't we move people around the country? I don't understand why we're preventing millions of people from working when we've not even made a dent on the surge capacity of the Nightingale hospitals. Intervene if you like.
About Nightingale hospitals. There's not enough staff to staff the Nightingale hospitals. You'd have to take them out of the hospitals that they're trying to give some relief to. That's why they're not being used.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'd given me a bit more time, and that's where I'd like to see money spent. I'd like to see money spent on surge capacity in the NHS rather than paying people not to work. But you know what, like it or not, my constituents are going to be thrown into more weeks of extraordinary lockdown, and there is no possibility of this not now happening given the opposition's decision to abstain. Well, I'm going to support the government's decision and message to comply, and indeed our remarkable Prime Minister in particular. But I'll be hard pushed to support the government in future if there's a realistic possibility of the government being forced to seek a different path. Churchill himself had a wide mix of generals and advisers. Thank you.
Sir Ed Davey.
Madam Deputy Speaker, COVID is still taking a heavy toll on the lives of our constituents. And with this job crisis and health crisis, we all want to get back to life as normal as soon as possible. So the news of the 3 vaccines couldn't be more welcome. But the priority now has to be keeping people safe while ensuring no one is left behind and businesses are supported. The science is clear. Restrictions are needed to save lives and protect the NHS from being overwhelmed. And that's why Liberal Democrats have backed all the previous lockdowns and the previous tiering system. But at the same time as supporting those past restrictions, we have consistently called on ministers to do 3 crucial things. First, provide clarity. We need transparency and honesty in government communications, so people understand what the rules actually are, why they must follow them, and aren't just left confused and unconvinced. Members opposite have talked about Scot eggs and pork scratchings. I asked the Prime Minister about whether he could assure people they could get tests before travelling to see their loved ones at Christmas, and he couldn't answer that question clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's not surprising that the general public are unclear what the government is trying to tell them. The second issue we've raised is that we need proper financial support for all individuals and all businesses impacted by these restrictions, especially the self-employed, the hospitality sector, the tourism sector and charities. Otherwise, people are excluded. And the third point we've made time and time again is the most critical. We need a comprehensive system of test, trace and isolate, so every case of COVID is identified fast and the right measures to prevent new infections are taken fast. Sadly, the government has failed to deliver on each of those things. But let me, Madam Deputy Speaker, focus on isolation, because I don't think this has had the attention it deserves. Back in September, the Prime Minister promised that anyone on a low income who had to self-isolate would get a £500 payment, so they could afford to self-isolate. What's the reality been? The money simply has not got through, and isolation rates have become dangerously low. The head of the Resolution Foundation told the Work and Pensions Committee recently that there is almost no take-up of this payment. Why? Because you can't get it if you're told to self-isolate by a local contact tracer instead of a national one. Because you can't get it if you have to stay at home because your child's been told to self-isolate. So 7,000 people who've applied for their £500 in Yorkshire and Humber have been turned down. That's 60% of all applicants. In Oldham, it's 50%. In Liverpool, it's 80%. Madam Speaker, is anyone surprised that the opposition has no confidence in this government's ability to handle this pandemic? So I'm afraid, reluctantly, we cannot support the government today. They have failed to set out the clear criteria for which areas are in each tier. They have failed to engage with local authorities, and they've failed to provide the clear evidence to this House. Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister's proposals are arbitrary, confusing and chaotic, and we will not support them.
Dr. Andrew Murison.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I find myself more able to support the government today than I was on the 5th of November. And the reason for that was last month I was concerned about the lack of a plan B and the fact that we might have to have such a thing in the event that there was a prospect of a third or fourth or fifth wave from this terrible virus. It seems to me that we are on the brink of a game changer now, in the way that perhaps we couldn't be confident about last month. And I think that is important, because in the event that we can turn this around in the near future, the need for protected isolation falls away. And it's for that reason that I see the logic of what the government is attempting to do on this occasion in a way perhaps that was eluding me ever so slightly on the 5th of November. Madam Deputy Speaker, the other thing that probably gets it over the line for me is that the UK appears, with what is proposed for tomorrow onwards, to be doing more or less the same thing as other similar jurisdictions. And that isn't just followership, it's important, because each one of those countries, with all their experts, will have been making similar assessments and coming to, broadly speaking, the same sort of conclusions, and that is important. Now, from the leaked documents that we saw in October, the South West and Midlands would have been the first in the run of our hospitals to have gone over capacity. And there's a big difference between the two, however, in that the prevalence of the disease was very, very different, with the Midlands being much larger than the South West. Now, the document suggested South West hospitals would have been overwhelmed on the 9th of November, and the Nightingales on the 24th of November. In the event, at peak, at my largest hospital, the RUH in Bath, we had 70 cases, and that was on the 24th of November, 19 days after lockdown. That seems to me to vindicate the model, it seems to me to vindicate the action, and even, perhaps, the broad brush tiering approach now being proposed by the government, apropos the point about the Midlands and the South West. In all of this, we have to understand that there is a huge margin of uncertainty. We also need to understand that the facts are changing all the time. We have to sometimes accept, I would say this to some of my colleagues, that sometimes there isn't evidence in the way that maths, physics and chemistry provides us with evidence. We have to deal instead with what appears to be biologically plausible. We have to look at outbreak studies. We have to look at the application of common sense to anecdote. Now, I too am disappointed that the proposed tiering system has so little
granularity. But we have found, to our dismay, that the tools to do comprehensive contact tracing that would have facilitated such granularity simply are no longer there. Even Germany now is finding that to be the case. In 2 weeks' time, it is to be hoped that we will have been able to appraise the situation against the 5 points, plus the knowledge of human geography that we facilitated with the restrictive measures we put in place earlier this year, and boroughs and districts, where appropriate, will be able to be re-tiered to the satisfaction of colleagues. The fundamental problem is our lack of public health capacity, and that's something we need to address in the longer term, notwithstanding the positive early steps the government has taken at pace in relation to things like the Joint Biosecurity Centre and the National Institute for Health Promotion. Finally, in agreement with my right honourable friend, the member for Ashford, can I say that the Prime Minister is no natural Grinch, but we need to be very, very careful about having 5 days of partying over Christmas, only to regret it in January.
Emma Lewell-Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are in a never-ending cycle of national and localised lockdowns and restrictions that aren't working. The daily death toll remains high. Hundreds continue to die every single day. Infection rates are ever shifting. People are seeing their sacrifices and impact on their liberties and freedoms in their wider community not yielding the results they were promised. This government have squandered any goodwill they had and have lost the confidence of the country and many in this place. I voted for the current lockdown through gritted teeth. It was to give the government one last attempt to try and get the virus under control and sort out the shambles that is test, track, trace and isolate. They have failed. Thousands of contacts continue to be missed. As a result, thousands of people continue not to isolate and the virus continues to spread. Instead, the government have used this pandemic as an excuse to bung our taxes to their mates, reaching new levels of democracy. It's clear now that the government are void of any proper strategy. Their mixed messaging and ever-shifting rules and regulations have caused confusion. So public health measures put in place aren't being given enough time to embed properly into our everyday behaviour. I have asked repeatedly the Secretary of State and various ministers what will be different this time that will mean these new local lockdown measures will work. Each time I get mass testing. Yet this mass testing is now community testing, and it's transpired that there's no actual plan at all about how to carry it out, and it is still not in place. The long-awaited cost-benefits analysis was poor, but we don't really need it. We can all see what is happening to the economy. We can all see the impact this is having on loneliness, mental health, poverty, and delays in cancer treatments. I do not accept that voting against these measures today is to let the virus rip. It is saying to the government, come back with something else, come back with something better and more acceptable. We need a more sensible approach, one where we can live with the virus in the safest way possible, that gives clear public health messaging, indicates how areas can move between and in and out of tiers, gives proper, equitable financial support to each area, and protects the most vulnerable and does not trash our economy. I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this isn't easy for any of us, and we are grappling with a virus that, quite frankly, we still do not know enough about. But I do know that what is currently being done, what we are about to repeat again, did not work, and I do not think it will work this time. Today, I will be voting against these measures because I absolutely must do what I feel is best for my wider community.
Sir Desmond Swing.
Why will you be able to buy a pint in a sports venue without getting anything to eat? But if you order a pint in a pub, you'll have to have a substantial meal. I'll leave that hanging as the great existential question of the day. Madam Deputy Speaker, suppression in anticipation of vaccination is the reason for these measures before us today. But people have been writing to me for months, terrified that a vaccine will be compulsory. And I've responded by saying, don't be so absolutely ridiculous. It could never possibly happen. We're a Conservative government, after all. And now we discover that a vaccination may be a passport to the acquisition of your civil liberties, and without which you will have all sorts of things that you would be able to do denied to you. Can I say that that would be absolutely disproportionate to a virus with a mortality rate of verging on 1%. It would equally be a terrible precedent to set for other vaccines and medicines. So I hope that we can get away from that. The way to persuade people to have a vaccine is, of course, to line up the entire government and its ministers and their loved ones and let them take it first, and then get all the lovies, the icons of popular culture, out on the airwaves singing its praises. To have any kind of suggestion of coercion absolutely feeds the conspiracy theory that we are being cowed and our liberties being taken away. Very
I'm extremely grateful to him for giving way. Will he agree with me that it's not enough for the government merely to refrain from coercing people? The government's also got to pay attention to implicit coercion. That is, if the government turns a blind eye to allowing businesses like airlines and restaurants to refuse to let people in unless they've had the vaccination, the government's got to decide whether it's willing to allow people to discriminate on that basis.
Discrimination. It would be vaccinationism, which we must, of course, resist. The other thing that any kind of coercion would do would be to set the seal on this government's reputation as the most authoritarian since the Commonwealth of the 1650s. But it is as nothing to the enthusiasm that we've seen from the front bench opposite for even more coercive and restrictive measures.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hard to follow the last speaker for New Forest West, but can I say that, first of all, as a Northern Ireland member, people may say, well, what input do you have on a debate which is about restrictions in England? The truth of the matter is, of course, that whatever restrictions are introduced in England tend to be replicated and indeed sometimes magnified by the Health Minister in Northern Ireland. And let me just give one example. In my own constituency, the lovely Carnfunnock Park, I could go for a walk through it today with a golf bag over my shoulder. But if I dodged through the hedge into the golf course next door, I'd be breaking the law, because the law was introduced here that golf would be, if you played golf, you'd somehow kill some of the population, so therefore you couldn't do it. And so the restrictions here will have an impact in Northern Ireland. Now, I could live with restrictions if they actually prove to be effective. But the very fact we're discussing another form of lockdown today for the 4th time, and the same arguments are being used. If we don't have it, the health service is going to be overwhelmed, we're going to have an increase in the R rate, we're going to have an increase in infections, people are going to die. And we've had lockdowns before, and yet we still have the same factors coming to the fore once again. It's hard to do controlled experiments, of course, with something like this, but the New England Journal of Medicine did do a report on an experiment that was done with Marines, where 2,000 were totally isolated and took all the restrictions that we have introduced here. And then the other 2,000 did not. And they didn't find any difference in infection rates. Not widely published, because of course some of the science around that, where it's contradictory, is not listened to. The second reason why I'm against the lockdown is because of the disproportionate effect it has on business. And if...
Thank the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, for giving way. One of my concerns, and does the Honourable Gentleman share them, that for dentists who have followed the rules of face, space and distance and all the precautions, and the R rate is kept low, for barbers and hairdressers the same thing, where they've followed all the regulations and by appointment only, and their R rate is not 0.05. Does he not feel at this time for those who follow the rules and do it correctly, they should be rewarded rather than stopped having their business?
Yes, and of course that's the frustration for many people, that they see their businesses being ruined by restrictions, even though, first of all, it can't be identified that their businesses are responsible for infection being spread, and secondly, they've taken all the precautions. And the number of small businessmen and women who have sacrificed their savings, who have given their lives to building up their business, who have taken risks with their own money, to find their businesses squeezed by the powerful hand of the state. It causes anger, and quite rightly it causes anger, to see people who get tossed out of their jobs by the same powerful hand, all on the basis that these restrictions are necessary. I think that we've got to ask ourselves, and it's significant, the government does not want to put beside the benefits of the restrictions on health, the impact which it has on the economy, and we don't have that stark comparison being made, because of course if we did that, we would find that a lot of questions would have to be asked. And of course, we also have to remember that many other people who are suffering from diseases which could be cured, which could be treated, and would save lives, but whose deaths will not be reported on the BBC in the daily death toll which we're given every night on the news. Those people equally have a right to ask questions. Why is the health service so distorted that our lives are not valued in the way that they should be? The third reason why I'm against this is because I believe that the methods we've introduced have led to a huge incursion into our personal liberties. And it's been done, many people have been amazed, how have people acquiesced? It's been done through Project Fear. And I've got to say, I've listened to ministers on the other side during the debate on Brexit, where they condemn Project Fear. Well, we now have Project Fear on steroids. There are people who are afraid to leave their houses. There are children who are worried when their class is closed down that either their wee friends are going to die or they're going to die. That is no way to run a democracy, and that is no kind of policy that this Parliament should be supporting. And for that reason, I'll be opposing these measures tonight.
Mark Harper.
Deputy Speaker, thank you very much. COVID is a very serious disease, and I take it very seriously, as I do the pressures on our National Health Service. And it's disappointing that some who are faced with different arguments or questions always accuse those of us who have a different view of pretending we want to either let it rip or present, as the government did yesterday in its economic analysis, a counterfactual which is doing nothing. It's not about that. It's about doing the right thing that's going to be effective. And that's why I wrote to the Prime Minister with 70 colleagues asking for as much information as we could have about the effectiveness of the measures being proposed. And that's not just, by the way, Madam Deputy Speaker, whether they're too tough. It's also whether they're going to be effective enough. They definitely come with big economic costs, and I want to know if we're going to pay those economic costs and those costs on people's lives and livelihoods. I want to know that they're going to have the effect on suppressing the virus, and we simply don't have that information, and the modellers that work for SAGE are very uncertain even about the effects of tiers as a whole, let alone individual measures. I'm also concerned, Madam Deputy Speaker, from talking to my local National Health Service about pressure on the health service. But again, I asked for the modelling and the forecasting about NHS capacity. That was leaked before this lockdown that we're in at the moment, but never published, never substantiated, and the specific forecast in that leaked information turned out to be wrong. And all I ask is that ministers share with the House the modelling and forecast that they've seen that have led them to come to the conclusions that they have, if they wish to take the House with them. Unfortunately, they've so far failed to do so. I also just want to say a word about the hospitality industry, which the Prime Minister in his opening remarks agreed was taking a disproportionate impact. There's very little hard evidence that COVID transmission is high in those settings, and if the COVID secure guidelines to have any meaning, the government should work with the sector to understand if there are risks, how they can be managed. And I'll give you one example, Madam Deputy Speaker. In papers published at the end of last week, there were some concerns raised about ventilation. Two things. The government's never discussed that with the industry subsequent to the publication of the guidance in the summer. And the UK Hospitality Organisation thinks that 80% of premises are up to the specifications that SAGE think are required. So if there are issues, let's deal with them. Let those businesses open, not just give them taxpayers' money to keep them closed. The final point, I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is about what happens at the vote in January. I'm afraid, based on the fact that the government, I don't think, has provided the information necessary to the House today to take decisions which are, by any normal measure, draconian, I'm afraid I won't be able to support them. But I would say to my honourable friend on the front bench, if the government wants to maximise the unity, both in the House and in our party at the vote in January, it needs to start treating members of Parliament properly. And it needs to start sharing with members of Parliament the information that I hope ministers are asking for, but I fear are not. And if they were to do that, even though these are difficult decisions and the forecasts are uncertain, I think people would be prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's because they're not treating the House like that, but I'm afraid on this occasion, I'm not prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt, and I will be voting against the regulations this evening.
Derek Twigg.
Speaker, the honourable member for the Forest is absolutely right, is that the government has not provided the information that the House requires in order to make a balanced judgment about what is the right thing to do in terms of these regulations. But I cannot vote for these regulations. My constituents are sick and tired about the way they're being treated by the Prime Minister and the government. Right. The government's strategy seems to be all over the place, Madam Speaker. It depends really, by all accounts, who the Prime Minister last spoke to decide the strategy. Now, friends of the government have made millions, while some of my constituents have had no help whatsoever and have lost their jobs, or their jobs are hanging on by a thread. Just last night, 2 constituents told me they'd been made redundant, and another told me that their son had lost his apprenticeship. And of course, there's the forgotten and excluded by this government. Those people who are sole traders, who are limited companies, self-employed, who are getting little or no help. And hospitality, which has been sacrificed by this government. I don't know about the Prime Minister and ministers, but in my constituency, many pubs are very much part of the community and the culture. And they, in restaurants, have done everything possibly they can to make them COVID safe and spent many thousands of pounds. There is no evidence still that any sizable outbreaks occur in hospitality. Now, I have many constituents who have gone into debt, and that with their rent, mortgages and bills, and have no idea how they'll pay for it. And of course, that has unintended health consequences as well. There are also, the children are petrified about the exams next year because they've been in and out of school for months now. Now, a question that's never been properly addressed, which I have spoke about on a number of occasions in this House, is the unintended health consequences. Now, I put in a Freedom of Information request to my CCG about referrals from GPs. Now, the information I got back was quite staggering, actually. So GP referrals, based on this Freedom of Information request for first outpatient appointment, cardio, so based on September 19 and September this year, for cardio, there was a 66% drop. For referrals for gastro, 64% drop. Renal medicine, 57% drop. On ophthalmology, 68% drop. Now, that is quite staggering in referrals. Never mind the waiting times that have been missed time and time again. I've also asked now for figures from the Clinical Commission Group to let me know whether there have been excess deaths at home which are non-COVID. Now, I just want to briefly mention about councils who are not getting enough support. Halton Council is doing a really good job, but they're going to have a deficit of about 8.6 million. They need more support. It's important we give more support and financial aid to councils to do more locally. Local is better and proves to be more effective. I want to briefly turn to the vaccine. If we're hearing what is correct, that these vaccines are going to be very effective, it is even more crucial that the government gets its strategy right for delivery. And we do not see a repeat of the incompetence we have seen over PPE and test and trace. We need to make sure we all work together for effective take-up. Now, retaining the confidence of people will be crucial to this. We do not need government incoherence, because on the 16th of October, the Secretary of State said the new simpler system of alert levels will be in place. 3 weeks later, we went into a national lockdown. Today, we're seeing that the government wants us to put in place new regulations and restrictions. And this will be reviewed again in later this month. My constituents deserve to be treated with respect, not patronised. That they may be granted a few days of normality over Christmas by you as some sort of reward for their sacrifice is not on, Madam Deputy Speaker. In the real world, many people will not have an enjoyable Christmas as they've lost their jobs and are desperately worried about their finances. Well, I'm not against restrictions in talk. There's got to be some restrictions, but there's got to be a balance about that and the economic and health consequences as well. But I'll be voting against these restrictions tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me start, if I may, with some positives. And particularly I'd say to the Minister, for whom I have the highest regard. Her team in the Department of Health has done some things phenomenally well in the last few months. I look at the work they've done in preparing this country for a substantial supply of vaccines. I look at the work they've done on testing, both of which are really far in excess of what's been achieved by any other European country. That is something they should all be proud of and take credit for. It is also the case that when they face criticisms over issues like track and trace, the reality is the problems they face are exactly the same as those being faced in other countries. You just have to read the media in France and Germany and elsewhere to realise these are not issues that are unique to this country. They're not issues of some individual form of incompetence in government here. They're challenges being faced by all major nations. And that's something they should always bear in mind as they deal with the inevitable flack that flies around in a difficult time like this. But I also say to the Minister, and I don't say this to her personally because I have the highest regard for her, and I hope she'll take this back to the Secretary of State. What I want to do is explain to her why it is that confidence in much of what is now coming out of her department, of Public Health England, the presentations we hear, the data we see, is now undermining our confidence in this House, in the messages we are being given. And that is fundamentally important when we're being asked to support measures going forward. Not now, but also particularly in January, since quite clearly these measures are going to get passed today. But there is another checkpoint in January, and the government has a big task to do to win the confidence of all of us at that time. And I think there are two particular areas of concern I have. The first is in relation to the data that we see. It is a matter of record now that when we were shown the data that justified this current lockdown, back at the end of October, the 4,000 deaths a day figure, that information used to justify what was happening was a long, long way away from being accurate, and indeed has been discredited by the people who authored it as being relevant for that purpose. So that was one example. The second example then, we were told about the risks to the health service, and that lockdown only could sort the problem because the tier system just wasn't doing enough. But we now know also that that was questionable, because actually the progress we've seen in hospital admissions, in the death rate in the last month, almost none of that can be attributed to the current infection, hospitalisation, serious illness and so forth. And the reality is, if you look at the data that was published by her department, it showed hospitalisations were slowing at the start of the lockdown period. And actually just yesterday we saw figures, I saw them in my own county in Surrey, they were released nationally. What we've seen is actually the health service is not at capacity at the moment. The bed occupancy rates are lower than they were last year, and in my county in Surrey, 100 beds with oxygen are currently occupied by COVID patients. So these are the things that sow seeds of doubt. The other thing that sowed seeds of doubt, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the reluctance of the public health world to have a balance of risk between health needs and economic needs. We see that in the treatment of the hospitality sector. Don't ask me why on earth pubs can't open in that 5 days over Christmas so we can have a meal out of the pub rather than a meal at home. One example of risk aversion. The treatment of the aviation sector, where we can test the whole of the population of Liverpool, but we won't use testing to reopen key economic routes for the country as we approach the post-Brexit world. So my message to the government is this. There are many things it's done that have been fantastic over the last few months in dealing with extraordinarily difficult circumstances. But if this risk aversion continues, and if the data continues to have these question marks, how on earth can we on these benches be relied upon to be confident in the decisions that are being taken?
Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It seems to me, listening to the debate and listening also to my constituents, that the government has a problem with being trusted in this field at the moment. And I think much of that, and I'm trying to be supportive, comes from the fact that there's a feeling there isn't total transparency. I think that trust of the kind that's needed to impose these sorts of measures must come from utter openness and transparency. And if the government were to learn anything from the nature of these debates over the months, I think that that's the lesson they should learn. They must be more open and more transparent. They keep changing the rules in a confusing way repeatedly, and they seem to often be more interested in managing difficulties from their own backbenchers than they are in communicating properly with the public and promoting understanding about why these measures are sometimes necessary. I want to say a little bit about the experience in Liverpool, because we were the first area into Tier 3, the old Tier 3. We've already got a new one starting tomorrow, the old Tier 3. And actually the reality is that infection rates have fallen enormously since then. Local leaders were asking for a full lockdown ahead of the Tier 3 arrangement and embraced Tier 3 happily because of what was happening. We had over 700 per 100,000 infections, and our hospitals were precious close to being totally overwhelmed. And the staff in those hospitals have had to work like absolute Trojans and are still dealing with very high levels of illness. So the reality is that the work done there and the mass testing has helped. We've seen the numbers fall from over 700 to under 100 per 100,000 in Liverpool, and that is an enormous fall and something that we're very grateful for. But it has relied upon solidarity, upon people in Liverpool helping each other, doing things they wouldn't necessarily want to do for each other. And it's this that has to be promoted, solidarity around the country, between people, between communities. Not we're all right at the moment, so why should we have to have these issues? That's what the government need to focus on. Ensuring routine testing for all high-risk workplaces is important. More testing of the kind that we've seen in Liverpool spread out across the country is tremendously important. And there also needs to be more done to help and support self-isolation, because that is the real problem. One of the lessons in Liverpool is that people have not downloaded the app, have not gone to get tested if they feel like they got a positive response, they couldn't comply. That is where we need to focus, helping people to comply. And if you live week by week on a wage that's only just enough to keep your head above water, to keep food on your family's table, you are not going to want to see what's happening, whether you're positive, Madam Deputy Speaker, unless you absolutely have to until you get symptoms. And you won't go for a test on a routine basis if you're worried sick about what you'd be able to do if the answer is yes, you're positive. That is where we've got to focus more effort. The £500 test and trace self-isolation payment, far too few people are getting it. It is not an entitlement, and it should be. People should not have to jump through hoops at a worrying time to get it, and they do. Only 1 in 8 are qualifying for it. Many more people are being turned down, and local authorities in my area are being told that the money they've got to pay for it when it runs out, which it nearly has, will not necessarily be replenished. That is not a way forward if we're expecting people to comply. People have to be helped to comply when they are worried sick about whether they can put food on the table for their children.
Shalbrook.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hate this. I hate the whole situation, as do many people in the country. We're all trying to stay positive, but it is hard. I wake up every morning feeling angry. Why do we have to do this? Why are we going to do this? But after 10 minutes you think, well, what else can we do? Because fundamentally, the disease is the same today as it was at the beginning of the year. I've seen my parents for 3 hours since February. I was hoping to be able to meet them for Christmas. I was longing for it. But as with so many other families now, that cannot happen. And it cannot happen because the pandemic, the global pandemic, has fundamentally not changed. And I hear people say that excess deaths are only slightly higher than normal. But I remind them that that is with a lockdown. That is with a lockdown. And pressures on A&E have been reduced. Numbers out this week show that the fact that hospitality is closed, that alcohol-related emergencies at A&E are down significantly. And that's the point, is that when you're unwell, the NHS needs to be able to treat you. Now, there's been a lot of debate this afternoon about figures, one way or the other. But the reality is that in Leeds, the numbers last week were 418 and 100,000. They were 220 yesterday, they're 200 today. But NHS capacity is at 95 to 98% and hasn't changed, and that's the key. And we need to all make sacrifices to help that sick people do get the healthcare they need. But the tragedy of people dying cannot overlook the tragedy of businesses dying across many sectors, and not least hospitality. Especially in December, it's bumper month. I'm afraid I've got to say that the announcement the Prime Minister made today for wet pubs is risible. It's not good enough. I've had many people contact me. Michelle Dwan from the Victoria Hotel in Allerton Bywater. Justine Gregory of Salute at the White Swan in Rothwell, who I'm speaking to later on today. She contacted me very politely. She said, "We've spent thousands of pounds on hygiene and cleanliness measures. Every year we rely on significant cash boosts from Christmas. I know this is a big ask from the government that has already spent billions, but ultimately we are a viable, profitable business that the government has closed. Please, Minister, people need more support than they're getting." And I've got a huge amount of respect for my honourable friend, and I know she'll feed this back, but it's not gone unnoticed on the back benches that a little over 2 hours into this debate, we're on our third front bencher. And is the message going back clearly to the points which are being made today? That I don't believe we have any choice but to back these restrictions, because if we don't, at 1 minute past midnight tonight, there's a free-for-all. But we've got to stop playing Jeopardy and saying, if we don't back it for the health measures, there's a problem, and we'll think about what we're doing for businesses. The hospitality industry desperately needs our support. But if we don't back the measures, if there's a free-for-all, we run a very difficult situation, to perhaps use a term at this time of year, of the NHS saying, sorry, no room at the inn, and sending people away to die at home. We need to get control ASAP, and we need to help businesses stop dying. We need to put them on life support. We're taking away their lifeblood, and we haven't heard enough of that today. If we keep the numbers down from the vaccine is ready, we can get our country up and running as quickly as possible. Because when we do get up and running, there will be more everyday demands on the NHS, and we've got to make sure that COVID patients are at their minimum. Now, I've had a huge amount of correspondence threatening me, calling me every name under the sun if I vote for these restrictions tonight, but being a Member of Parliament is about holistic, tough decisions. Not hiding away and dodging leadership that we're once again seeing from the other side of the House, but actually saying that we don't like it, we've got to make these decisions, but I say to my honourable friend, please take back to the government that I will be voting for these restrictions tonight, but the package has been put into place for the hospitality industry at the most profitable time of the year is just not good enough.
Dan Carter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to focus my remarks on these health regulations in relation to my constituency. Liverpool-Walton is the most deprived constituency in England. It has the highest youth unemployment in the country. It has child poverty at 40%. And the effect of the pandemic and these restrictions coming on top of 10 years of austerity and cuts has been to push many more families over the edge and into poverty. And we've had big policy announcements from this government, but the reality for too many people has been little or no help from government and little hope for the future. Jobs lost, businesses folded, communities going under. And Liverpool will move into Tier 2 tomorrow if these regulations are passed. The first place moving into a lower tier from before the lockdown. And Liverpool's mass testing pilot has been impressively delivered by our local public health teams, the council, Mayor Joe Anderson, and with the support of armed forces personnel. And what we know is that around 1,000 asymptomatic cases have been detected, and we await the scientific community's evaluation. But because this is a pilot, there are lessons to be learned from it. And I think the first lesson this House should learn is that a system delivered by local public health
experts, as opposed to profiteers led by central government, is the most effective way to deal with the virus. In the most deprived parts of the city, only 4% of people came forward at first to be tested. And I've spent time listening to people locally and hearing about their experiences and what they face during this pandemic. And they are all too aware that testing positive means losing income if they have to self-isolate. They know the government's eligibility criteria for the £500 payment is far too strict. And they're right. In Liverpool, around 80% who applied were rejected. And the discretionary payments, which the local council has more control over, is capped and funding is set to run out before Christmas. Then you've got statutory sick pay, £95.85 a week, among the lowest rates in the whole of Europe, put simply not enough to live on. And if that wasn't bad enough, millions not even entitled to that. Nobody should be forced to choose between protecting public health and their own financial security. But that's the choice this government is forcing on the poorest in society. And the government knows it's failing. It knows from its own polling only 11% of people asked to self-isolate are doing so. And it's time it asked why. Because test and trace will only work if everyone is properly supported to isolate. And I have to say, whether it's the self-isolation grant, PIP, universal credit, doesn't it tell us everything we need to know? That the poorest people, the disabled, the vulnerable, have had to jump through humiliating, dehumanising hoops created by Tory ministers for years now to get the meagre levels of support that they're entitled to, whilst corporate cronies and Tory donors get to jump the queue, get put in fast lanes for COVID contracts for billions, literally billions of pounds of public money, without transparency, without competition, and without any accountability.
Sir Charles Walker.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, in these debates we talk about elderly people as if they're not in the room. We talk over their heads, we patronise them. We say to them, this is being done in your name to keep you safe. And actually, really, your view is of little interest to us. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been contacted by many grandparents and parents who say, Charles, not in my name. I don't want to see my children's future destroyed, my grandchildren's business destroyed. I don't want to see my son and daughter worrying about losing their home, worrying about losing their livelihood. I don't want to see my grandchildren arrested on the streets of London for daring to raise their voice in protest at the removal of their liberties. Old people, the people that we patronise, have a view, and we should listen to it. Now, of course, this isn't a universal view, but it is a view that is held by many. Now, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster asked on Saturday, how could we protect every old person? The answer is obvious to everyone in this place. We could not protect every old person. But we could have provided them with the information to make informed choices about their own safety. Because, funnily enough, you don't get old by being that stupid. There's a degree of wisdom in older people, isn't there? I hope to achieve that wisdom one day myself, Madam Deputy Speaker. But there is a serious point here. No government can abolish death. It is impossible. 615,000 people die every year in this country. And not every death is a tragedy. It is so distressing when I hear leaders of political parties, leaders of their communities, leaders in this place say every death was a tragedy. A tragedy is when a child dies. A tragedy is when some young woman or young man dies, or when you are cut down in your middle years. But when we say it is a tragedy when someone at 80 or 90 has met their mortality, we diminish that life so well lived. We diminish the love, we diminish the way that person was cherished and the way that person was valued. So please, please can we just change the narrative when we talk about death, because not all deaths are equal. There is the same outcome. But to compare the death of someone of 90 with the death of someone of 19 is not right. It is not right. But of course there has been tragedy attached to the death of elderly people, and that tragedy is that in their final days and months they've been denied the touch of the people that they love. The people that they love. We have kept families apart for the good of an old person that is desperate to see their child, is desperate to be cared for by their daughter in their final months and weeks. So my plea to this place is, please can we involve older people in this discussion, because they love their children and grandchildren and want to see them prosper. They want to see them have the same chances and opportunities that they had in their life.
Maria Miller.
Madam Deputy Speaker, yet again we're here debating measures that restrict the freedoms of the people we represent, and I don't think that's anything any of us would have dreamt of just 12 months ago when we all stood at the general election. But now this decision falls to us. So we have to balance the evidence. The evidence of the threat to health and life with the threat to people's livelihoods, mental health and education. And in doing that, in making that choice, we take people with us based on the evidence. And it's clear to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, we understand this virus better now than we ever did before. And there's more evidence now in this debate than ever before. And I've been contacted by many people in my constituency, Madam Deputy Speaker, who don't want to throw away the gains we've made so far in advance of the rollout of mass testing and vaccines. NHS staff, school workers and shop workers who don't want to see an increase in infection in their community, making it more difficult for them to be effective in their roles. And the Prime Minister, my right honourable friend, has been very clear today that the tiers we are debating will be reviewed every 2 weeks. And the Prime Minister gets my full support for that approach rather than a continued lockdown if in return ministers can carefully consider two things, and I know my right honourable friend on the front bench will be listening carefully, which I believe which will help us continue to take the country with us through to the end of this dreadful pandemic. And I speak, Madam Deputy Speaker, representing a constituency where infection rates have fallen by 40% since the beginning of this lockdown, and our hospital trust have fewer than 10% of their beds being used to care for patients with coronavirus, yet we're moving from Tier 1 to Tier 2. The first issue the government really has to help us with is data. Data is our most powerful weapon, but we need to better understand what it's telling us. We have a data mountain that has been amassed. I welcome the 5-pillar approach that the government has taken, but what we need is clear and agreed process to analyse that. For regular analysis at a local level from our public health directors, clear and transparent input into the decision-making of ministers, clearly set out roles for our directors of public health in that decision-making process, setting out local infection control actions that are being taken, and setting out the capacity of our hospitals to deal with coronavirus without impacting on other elective and non-coronavirus illnesses. We need to see, as members of Parliament, that local professional leadership directly inputting into the decision-making process and getting rid of the confusion and conjecture that is surrounding so much of the information at the moment. Secondly, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to follow the human geography of the epidemic, not the blunt tool of upper-tier authority boundaries, which bear little relation to the everyday lives of the people we represent. Hampshire, my own constituency, is 47 miles long. It's the largest county in the southeast of England with 1.3 million people, yet it's been treated the same. Can we please look at breaking down the ways in which the country is split, and perhaps in Hampshire particularly a north-south split, which better reflects the infection rates. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, the last thing I want is to vote for these restrictions today, but we can't throw away the gains we've made so far. In the next 2 weeks, can we see from the government a clear process to build the confidence of our constituents in the data that's available, and tiers that follow the human geography of this pandemic, not administrative regions? That way we're better to explain, we're better able to evidence decisions, and we're better able to take people with us.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for calling me to speak in this important debate. The UK has suffered one of the worst death rates, coupled with an economic crash that's greater than any of our international competitors. The government's COVID approach has failed. And I do note the timing of this debate, just hours before the national lockdown regulations expire, in a clear tactic to pressurise MPs. It is the government's responsibility, with its substantial majority, to secure their own policy. The Conservative government have a majority of 80. And I don't believe that MPs, particularly Labour MPs, should be placed under pressure to facilitate this government's agenda when it's clearly failing our country. Individuals, the excluded, and businesses in my constituency cannot afford to pay the price for the government's mistakes on test, track and trace, and a tier system that's clearly not fit for purpose. The levels of government support are not sufficient. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll be voting against what is effectively a third lockdown, particularly in my region in the North East. The government have never had a clear and consistent strategy. The Prime Minister has swung between the scientific evidence and political pressures. We've had 9 months of U-turn after U-turn, eroding public confidence and trust in government. No doubt the Prime Minister's wholehearted and uncritical defence of a special advisor breaking the COVID rules has contributed to an undermining of public trust in terms of their willingness to comply with COVID restrictions. Today we heard of a last-minute £40 million bailout for pubs, not introduced because the government wanted to support the industry, but as a payoff to secure the votes of Tory rebels. The government could have my vote tonight, Madam Deputy Speaker, with a competent and comprehensive support package for individuals and businesses in my constituency. First, we need to fully compensate the hospitality sector. Bars and clubs have spent many thousands of pounds to be COVID secure. It's reprehensible to turn on them now and say that that expenditure was for nothing. These, by and large, are not multinational or franchise businesses. These are community businesses that responded to COVID in our time of need and said, how can we help? They cooked and delivered meals and collected food throughout the first lockdown. They stood up tall and fed children during the school holidays when this government abandoned them. I'd like the Minister or the Prime Minister to tell Hordern Labour Club, the Flanders Pub, Dempsey's, working men's clubs in Seaham, Merton, Shotton, Easton, Peterlee and many more that this government will stand by them, and then I could vote for these restrictions. Can the Prime Minister tell me what is the average payout the £40 million announced today going to be? The campaign for pubs calculate it's £32.26 a day to cover the catastrophic losses that they're going to suffer over the Christmas and New Year period. Until the government changes course, delivers a consistent strategy, prioritises businesses and the excluded in my constituency and my region, supports workers rather than penalising them, I cannot in good conscience vote for yet more pandemic measures based on the say-so of the Prime Minister and Health Secretary. I'll vote against these measures, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the hope that we can have more targeted measures and that we're going to have more trust in the government and its approach to this pandemic.
Simon Clark.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. When I last spoke in one of these debates in September, I urged real caution over the imposition of tighter restrictions in the Tees Valley. We are all very conscious of the costs of lockdown to the economy, to our public finances, and of course to the wider physical and mental health of our constituents. What concerned me then, above all, was two things. First, that there was no clear route out of lockdown, that is to say, no consistent criteria against which areas like mine could assess their progress. And second, that this was a situation of potentially indefinite duration. I'm glad to say that in both regards, the situation has changed fundamentally. The government is quite right to be ending the national lockdown tomorrow, and it is a crucial feature of the system that will replace it, that the metrics are clear as to those which need to be going down in order for an area to move from Tier 3 to Tier 2 or from Tier 2 to Tier 1. Now, I will turn to the particular situation in the Tees Valley in a moment, but the other thing that has changed, of course, affects us all, and that is that over the last fortnight we've received the wonderful news that we have not just one but a range of vaccines which we know to be highly effective at stopping the spread of COVID-19. So we know today, in a way that we did not in September, that the long national nightmare will draw to a close in the early months of next year. We know today that we are buying time against a definite target as opposed to simply the hope of national deliverance. And to my mind, that does make a crucial difference to the logic of a tiered set of restrictions and the balance of risk that applies to our actions over the next 3 to 4 months. I can look my constituents in the eye in a way that I would have struggled to do earlier in the autumn and say that this is a terrible time, and I think my honourable friend, the member for Broxbourne, put it very well, a terrible time with terrible sacrifices inherent in it in terms of what we are asking of our constituents. But we are now entering the final phase of this battle. So the government will have my support today, and my focus is not so much on the question of whether tiered restrictions are the right thing, but on how we ensure we move the Tees Valley from Tier 3 to Tier 2 as rapidly as possible, and potentially as soon as the review date in the middle of this month. I'm glad to say the figures from the Tees Valley are now showing sustained improvement. In Middlesbrough, a number of positive cases fell by 40% over the course of the week to last Friday, including a 25% fall among the over 60s. Pressure on South Tees NHS is easing, both in terms of COVID occupancy and staff absence. The proportion of people